A moment later, however, he spotted his chance, as a few of the guards exchanged positions. He could see the directions that their faces were turned, even in the dark, and he knew that he had a few seconds to move. Jonathan raced towards the wall, not pulling out any stops, and winced halfway there as his body began to ache. However, he made it just in time, ignoring the burning pain spreading throughout his form. His body was covered in micro-tears and fractures from his supercharged smite skill, and he would not be able to use his full power until he either leveled up some more, or healed naturally. In his current state, there were certainly no levels to be had. Jonathan found himself standing under the wall, protected from above by the battlements. Nobody could see him down here, and he began to edge his way around the fortification, heading for the nearest gate. He didn't know how he was going to get in there, but he would figure that out when he got there. Leaving his companion behind was not an option, as it would show the falsehood of his own quest. How could he save everyone if he could not save a single person? He was beginning to become conscious of a burgeoning savior complex etching itself into his brain, a problem that he would have to address sooner or later. If his motivations were too simple, then he would be vulnerable to attack and manipulation. None of these thoughts would have ever occurred to him without his enhanced intelligence, and he found that he was much more prone to distraction than he had used to be. As Jonathan contemplated his path going forward, he reached the gate, and sidled under its shadow, making sure to look up in case any of the guards could see it. However, the battlements ringing the wall prevented the guards from looking down effectively, which was quite a design flaw. However, Jonathan suspected that barely anyone would even make it close enough to the wall for this to matter. He had been hard-pressed to make his way over to the wall, having to rely on all of his advantages to do so. His enhanced sight had allowed him to detect a lull in the watchfulness of the guards, and his strength and speed had allowed him to make use of it. If anyone else of a lower level had tried that, the guards would have spotted them almost instantly. Now that he was at the gate, however, the most glaring question remained. How was he supposed to get in? The wall stood in front of him, a monolithic edifice of dark metal and wood, banded with studs of even denser metal. It looked imposing, standing at almost 30 feet, and it certainly was in reality, as even. Jonathan had no idea how to get past it. He was too weak to break it down fully, and that would simply draw the attention of the guards. No, he would need to find a different means of entrance. The only way to get in was to break through the gate, as all of the other avenues of entrance were occluded, whether by the guards or by other factors. However, he still had his own secrets, and he decided on trying to use his mana and void energy to carve out a hole for himself. As he had been through the gate before, he knew just how wide it was, which was in line with his own power. The gate was about 3 feet thick, which, while quite thick for a gate, was thin enough for him to burrow through within a few minutes, as long as there were not any magical defenses at play. Jonathan summoned a blade of mana to his hand, using his new skill, and thrust it towards the door, condensing it as much as he could. He wanted to see if he needed to add his void energy as well. The blade stopped a millimeter away from the surface of the gate, held there by some unseen force. It seemed that he could be needing the power of the void after all. Jonathan drew upon the mysterious orb of energy that he forced his power over the element from, and dark purple light filtered into the mana sword, causing it to grow in power. A moment later, there was a light ping, and the field of energy stopping him from touching the gate shattered, and his sword sunk into it. It made almost no noise, which was perfect. Jonathan started to carve upwards through the gate, elongating the sword as he did so. Seeing as there was open air on the other side, he was able to simply make the slimmest sword that he could, rather than having to excavate as much material as possible. Still, it taxed his mana pool to maintain a grip on mana that far from his body, as while he did a similar thing with his touch of decay skill, this one required his conscious control, rather than simply impetus and willpower. It took him the better part of 5 minutes to create a hole large enough for himself to fit in, and he quickly pushed the wood and metal in, causing the outline of his hole to fall into the street beyond, with a low thud. He heard someone shift on the battlements above, and he quickly raced through the gap, heading for the nearest patch of shadow that he could find. As he made it there, he heard a raised voice behind him. "We have an intruder." One man shouted, presumably having found the piece of wood and metal resting on the street. "Shit. Do you think it's the target?" a woman asked in response, causing Jonathan to go very still. A few seconds later, the other man confirmed his decisions. "That Harlow bastard isn't stupid enough to show his face here again, is he? The whole might of the Crimson Sect will come crashing down on his head if he does so. Even I wouldn't want to be on their bad side. Even you. Jacob, those mages wouldn't even bother with you. All they would have to do is snap a finger, and you would be dead." Sensing that the usefulness of the conversation had come to a close, Jonathan strode off into the alleyways, able to somewhat remember the paths that he had taken within this place to get to the palace before. He knew that Edgar was somewhere around here, but he did not know if the man was dead or alive, or if he had been taken prisoner. As he moved, he reflected on the discussion that he had overheard. Odds were, the Crimson Sect that the guards had been talking about were the people living within the tower that had sent that colossally powerful beam of energy after him and Edgar. He agreed with the guards. They were not a force that he wanted to mess with. As he walked into the darkness, he missed the cluster of guards who were gathering around the piece of the gate, as well as the scarlet-robed man who stood with them, crackling with dark potency. He also missed the wave of crimson lightning that killed every last guard in the area. The Crimson Sect did not tolerate failure. Jonathan continued on, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him, and headed into the darkness, trying to keep out of sight of the main road. As he walked, he began to notice that the Citadel was under far higher alert than it had before. Barely a minute passed before he came across a small patrol, heading down the alleyway. Upon seeing him, they charged, with a few remaining behind to cast spells at him. In total, there were about a dozen guards, out of which 4 were mages. Jonathan snarled, and raced forwards, using about half of his maximum speed so as to not overtax his body. Streaks of vibrant light shot over the guard's head from the mages, but Jonathan ignored them. The few that did hit him only glanced off his armor, barely making a dent. A moment later, he was upon the guards, who, with his lack of full power, were actually considerably difficult opponents to face. These guards were well trained, and Jonathan found his punches and kicks matched by swift parries and blocks that transitioned into strikes to his armor. However, despite the fact that he had been weakened, his armor had not, and it was more than up to the task of taking the blows. However, his body still felt the pain of the strikes, and he was taking far more damage than before. He began to draw upon his martial prowess and his impact skill, using it to make his attack land with bone-crushing force. Shouts of pain accompanied his strikes, and the guards were slowly being whittled down. However, the noise had drawn other patrols, and Jonathan could hear the stomp of armored feet heading down the streets towards his position. "Damn it!" Jonathan shouted, before leaping over the heads of his opponents, and barreling through the loose array of mages, knocking them onto their backs. He was off into the darkness of the next alleyway in a matter of seconds, with the entire patrol on his tail. He had been detected, and it would now be far harder to escape. Jonathan picked up the pace, taking the burning in his muscles in stride as he ran. He needed to lose his pursuers in the twisting warren of streets around him, or else he could be quickly overrun. He was in no shape to fight a battle against dozens or even hundreds of similarly leveled fighters, though that assumed that he could do so anyway. He had never been forced to stay in any fights against large numbers of opponents before, but the space within the city was limited, and he would eventually be cornered. The edges of the dawn were starting to peek over the horizon, and Jonathan was starting to become worried that his cover would be gone when the sun came up. Day was a blindingly bright affair in the ash heaps, and there would be little to no places for him to hide. He could evade the lower-level soldiers well enough, but if Granath became involved, or some of the Crimson Sect that Jonathan had heard about, then he would be in trouble. Jonathan dashed along the shadows of the buildings, and spotted an entrance into one of the mansions that was at odds with the surroundings. Most of the buildings lacked any sort of entrances on the bottom floor, but this one was different for some reason. Jonathan raced up the short flight of stairs that led to the door in the wall, and burst through it, splintering the wood and stone with a single flying kick. He landed on a thick red carpet, in the middle of a room filled with a scene of debauchery like none he had ever seen before. 10 richly dressed men and women lounged at ease amid what looked like a cavorting carnival of naked and semi-naked bodies, all of whom seemed to be quite unhappy with their positions. The people lying down were at ease on large sofas and recliners, sipping on expensive-looking drinks, with lust evident in their eyes. One of the men was in the process of waving over a nearby woman as Jonathan entered. No wonder there was a door in a back alleyway. It was so that the entertainers could come and go without disturbing the sensibilities of the neighbors. Upon seeing Jonathan, one of the women screamed, drawing the attention of her other companions. One of the men rose from his recliner, and started to gather energy in his hands, causing the naked attendants to scatter, and head towards the rest of the house. "How dare you enter my house uninvited?" the man shouted, throwing a ball of fire towards Jonathan as he said the words. The man was quite weak, and Jonathan simply batted aside the attack with a fist coated in purple light, causing it to land on the carpet. Fire began to spread across the floor, and the people still in the room redoubled their pace. Jonathan dashed towards the exit, and sped past the shocked bystanders, whipping up the flames behind him into a frenzy with the wind of his passing. A few seconds later, he heard the wall collapse behind him as a group of soldiers stormed in. Jonathan emerged into a grand waiting room and burst through the door into a kitchen. He barely paid attention to the house around him, only vaguely noticing that it was quite richly appointed for a dwelling place in hell. It seemed that toadying up to Granath was quite a lucrative business in these parts. As the fire spread further and further, Jonathan smiled. None of these people deserved to live, save perhaps the entertainers who had been forced here unwillingly. Most of them had already been out by the time that the fire had really started to spread, and Jonathan did not worry too much about their safety. In any case, it would provide some cover for his escape. Edgar was somewhere within this maze of oversized houses and alleyways, and Jonathan would find him. At that moment, Edgar was barely half a mile away from Jonathan, and he started to hear the noises of conflict from the nearby parts of the city. Despite his hopes, it seemed as if Jonathan had come back for him. Edgar leaped down from the top of a building as he thought this, avoiding a circling patrol. However, most of the guards were heading towards Jonathan now, leaving Edgar mostly undisturbed. He landed with a muffled thump, using his elemental energy to cloak the sound of his landing with a wall of wind. Air was an unassuming element, but one that was quite useful, as well as the one that provided flight the earliest. Among the people of this universe, flight was one of the most sought-after skills, and it was seen as a status symbol of sorts. Even in a world where mastery over magic was common, there was still something special about defying the laws of nature and treating the air as nothing more than another mode of transport. Eventually, people became strong enough to levitate through sheer willpower, but Edgar was able to fly with an application of his wind magic, which was partly why he had attuned to the element. He did not have a true affinity yet, but he was eventually planning to become one with the air. However, all of that was quite unlikely in his current situation. As it was, he could lift himself off the ground for minutes at a time, but it was very mana-intensive, and it drained him if he did it for too long. If he was in any other situation, he would simply have flown out of the Citadel, but he was surrounded by higher-level fighters, and mages who could snipe him out of the sky in an instant, or even unbind his spells. No, he had to play the long game and hide within the city until he found his opportunity. Now that he realized that Jonathan had come back for him, however, he knew that he had more of a chance than he had thought. Edgar sped up his steps with his mastery over the wind, and ran towards the sounds of fighting on the other side of the Citadel. He would support his friend in any way that he could. Jonathan threw himself off the top of the building just as he heard soldiers breaking through the roof beneath him. He flew 20 feet into the air and landed on the nearest building, using it as a stepping stone to build up further speed. He needed to get away from his pursuers for long enough to concoct a plan, but that was seeming unlikely, given how fast the soldiers were. They were not holding anything back, sending their best and strongest after him. There weren't many tier 2s in the Citadel, which was a blessing, but Jonathan knew that one of them would probably be dispatched after him soon enough, and perhaps Granath himself. He just needed to buy enough time to find Edgar and get them out of here. As he ran across the buildings, he could hear a faint voice calling out his name, the sound carrying across the wind in a strange manner, almost as if it was being funneled to his ears by magic. Jonathan paused, remembering that Edgar possessed control over the element of air, and he turned, trying to trace the sound to its source. He saw a figure racing across the cobbled street about 500 feet away from him, and Jonathan smiled, recognizing it as Edgar. He was still wearing the guard armor from before, but the fact that he was on his own exposed him for who he really was. Jonathan looked behind him and then vaulted over the edge of the roof, landing a few seconds later on the streets. He ran towards Edgar, and as the man saw him, Edgar sped up as well. Behind Jonathan, however, there was a muffled thump, and before he could turn around, he heard the air behind him boil as a fiery bolt of energy was launched at him. It was not a spell that he could afford to tank, and he could feel the heat from here. If that thing hit him, it would melt through his armor and skin alike. Whoever had appeared behind him was a tier 2. Jonathan rolled away from the bolt, and it sliced through the air next to him, leaving a faint afterimage in his retinas. He turned around to see a man in crimson robes regarding him with a faint smile on his face, one accentuated by the seemingly ritualistic scars that marred his features. The man cracked with magical potency, and he began to weave together another firebolt in his hands, this one even larger than the one before. Jonathan Harlow. I have heard much about you, the man said as he did so, his voice raspy, as if he had been a lifelong smoker. You do not exactly live up the legend, I am sorry to say. What legend? Jonathan asked as he started to edge away from the man. He began to draw upon the power of the void within him, ready to unbind the skill if he needed to. Behind him, Edgar got ready as well, a sword of wind forming in his hands. Those who oppose the Lord are few and far between, and those who survive for more than a few days are even rare beasts entirely. You belong in that latter category, but judging by your strength, I cannot fathom why. Without another word, the man thrust the bolt of fire towards Jonathan, sending the searing spear of light through the air. Jonathan sent his mana and elemental energy out in front of himself in a wave, dispelling the spell as it entered his range of control. However, the spear of energy was too strong to be fully unbound, and its outer layer was simply stripped off as it passed into Jonathan's domain. Jonathan was able to dodge the weakened bolt, however, and Edgar stepped forwards, tearing it apart with his wind. With the majority of the energy gone out of the spell that the man had cast, a simple gust of wind was enough to blast it apart. Jonathan was upon the mage a moment later, his fist glowing with purple light. He sent his divinity into his fist as well, causing his gauntlet to light up with red power. His fist came down like a thunderbolt, leaving a trail of light in the air behind it. However, the mage simply laughed, and summoned a shield of energy around himself, stopping the attack in its tracks. Edgar edged forward after Jonathan, sending a gust of wind after him. The skill empowered Jonathan's blow, causing it to strike the shield with more force than normal. However, it was futile. The shield glowed brighter, but ultimately held, and Jonathan ran out of energy to maintain the purple aegis of void energy around his fist. However, the other mage was sweating by now, and Jonathan reveled in at least that small victory. While the main was under the effect of his shield, he was unable to attack back, a downside of having such a strong shield up. Jonathan drew back his fist, and struck again, putting even more power into it. He could not use his full abilities here as he was still weakened, and the effort would tear his body apart, but he was still able to eke out a passable amount of energy to send at his enemy. His fist crashed into the same place the first one had landed, causing the shield to grow brighter and brighter as it failed. A crack spread across the shield a moment later, and Jonathan thrust his mana into it, unbinding the shield from the inside, where it was weaker. It shattered with a noise like breaking glass, and Jonathan sent his left fist forwards, slamming it into the mage's face. Teeth shattered and bones broke as Jonathan's punch landed, sending the man flying. However, he was still tier 2, and the damage was mostly superficial. He hit the wall with a muffled thud and the stone cracked behind him. Jonathan ran forwards, ready to finish him, but he heard supporting troops coming from all directions, and he cursed. It was time for him to go. He could not finish off his opponent in a short enough time to evade the soldiers. Edgar and Jonathan raced off away from the scene, both men using as much of their strength as they could to run. Jonathan did not slow down for Edgar, and the other man was forced to use his magic to keep up. However, that was necessary for them both to escape. Wind blustered around Edgar, surrounding him in a halo of transparent air. The gusts around him reached hurricane levels of force, which was enough to add some spring to his step. Behind them, converging troops of soldiers surged into the street, and a few tier 2s came with them, outpacing their allies. Jonathan swore under his breath as he spotted more of the crimson-robed mages coming, these ones outfitted with staffs and wands. Two of them stopped and started to send powerful attacks towards Jonathan and Edgar, creating craters in the ground. Both men zigzagged across the streets, trying to avoid the strikes. The other two mages stayed with the soldiers, casting buffing skills that empowered their allies, allowing them to run faster. In addition, two heavily armored tier 2s raced ahead of the main group, wielding large greatswords. They were faster than Jonathan and Edgar, and if neither man did something soon, they would catch up soon, spelling their end. One of the tier 2s shouted something, and swung their sword, projecting a crescent moon of light towards Edgar's back. The man was too slow to dodge, and Jonathan heard him curse as it sliced through his side. Edgar kept running however, and he was not too injured. The attack had gone slightly off course on its way, which meant that rather than bisecting Edgar, it had only cut through the side of his stomach. "We need to head for the gate," Jonathan screamed over the noise of the pursuing forces. "There should be a gap in it from when I came in." Edgar simply nodded, and Jonathan took a hard left at the next intersection, using the wall as a guide to his direction. His enhanced memory allowed him to remember where exactly he had come in, and they were quite close to it. More and more projectile attacks came streaking through the air towards them as they ran, increasing in volume and power. Even worse, a field of static electricity was starting to descend on the area, and the air seemed to be suffused with ominous might, coming from the tower. A red glow hovered over the tower, which heralded the buildup of a powerful spell. If it was on the same magnitude as the one earlier in the day, then they were toast. However, Jonathan debuted that they would use an attack of that magnitude within the limits of the city. Granath might have been arrogant, but he was no fool and he would not destroy great swathes of his city to catch two people. Or perhaps he would, and he was simply biding his time. They both gritted their teeth as their stamina bars steadily dropped, and Jonathan's was heading below halfway empty at this point. The gate came into view a few minutes later, but it was guarded by hundreds of guards, led by a trio of armored figures with a variety of powerful weapons. More tier 2s. This would be the hardest stretch yet, not even accounting for the burgeoning ball of light over the tower in the distance. As they ran, more and more soldiers streamed out of the shadows to join the group standing in front of the gates, and as Jonathan and Edgar approached, they stopped, knowing that there was nothing that they could do. The two men paused about 200 feet away from the soldiers, and watched as one of the tier 2s stepped forwards, seemingly interested in talking rather than attacking, at least for now. "Surrender to us now, and you might have a chance of living. The Lord has taken interest in you." "That's too bad, as I cannot say the same," Jonathan replied, making sure to project as much authority into his voice as he could. He knew that he was probably about to die, but he could at least go out with dignity. It was better than being a slave to Granath in any case. "How to dash," the guard captain began, but he was interrupted. "I almost feel hurt by that refusal," a deep voice came from behind Jonathan, one that he recognized all too well. Do you not find me an honest and just ruler? Granath, Jonathan said. I was wondering where you were. He could feel the warm breaths of the titanic worm on his neck and turned slowly around to see the worm himself curled around a nearby building, watching him with curiosity in his eyes. A large burn mark was visible on his body, and Jonathan smiled, glad that he had at least been able to do something against the monster, if only because of his amulet. Behind him, the soldiers fell to their knees, prostrating themselves before either lord. Edgar stood resolutely behind Jonathan, looking up at the worm with a measure of fear, but also resolve, in his eyes. I was originally planning to kill you and devour your soul, as is my right, but after you pulled out that little light show, courtesy of the Church of Redeeming Light, I had to find out more for myself. It has been eons since I had last dealt with their ilk. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine as he heard the worm's words. He had almost instantly connected him to the people who had once lived within that ruined city out in the ash. Jonathan supposed that was only fair, given that Granath had fought against them in the past. What do you want from me then? Would you not be better served simply killing me? Jonathan asked, wondering why. Because those pathetic fools were thought to be long gone from this circle, to the point where nothing of them remained. I know of that ruin in the desert, of course, but I had thought it long plundered of its riches. All of the gold and artifacts from the church are safely ensconced within my treasury. However, it seemed that a few things escaped my notice. I always wondered where the diary of that fool Patrolanus had been stashed. I can only assume that you have it. Jonathan did not respond, slowly plodding a way out of this place. He knew that the diary was basically useless to Granath, as it would destroy itself before allowing the worm to read it, but he could only assume that it would be better to not let it fall into Granath's hands at all. I can tell what you are thinking. You believe that the book will destroy itself before letting me read it. However, who says that I have to read it? You can always do it for me. Jonathan instantly realized what Granath planned to do, and why he had kept Jonathan alive, rather than simply killing him in an instant. He needed him to read the book for him, to expose the secrets of the diary to himself, and Jonathan knew that Granath's methods of persuasion would not be pretty. He could stand pain, but he suspected that the Circle Lord had methods that even he could not imagine. Jonathan gave Edgar a look, and the man nodded, suddenly summoning a whirlwind around himself and Jonathan, briefly obscuring them from view. Granath roared in rage, and sped forward, moving like a blur. However, he was a tiny bit too slow, given the distance, and Edgar managed to levitate into the air, along with Jonathan, before they were caught. Jonathan sent his void energy into the swirling wind around himself, focusing on empowering it, rather than unbinding it. He did this by removing the obstacles of air resistance and friction in his way with the destroying power of his element, rather than trying to blend it with the air elemental energy that Edgar was using. It was an inspired use of the element, and he could feel his mastery increasing as he did so. They streaked off like a comet of white and purple, narrowly avoiding a storm of projectiles that came their way. A moment later, there was a thunderous boom, and the horizon turned red as the attack that had been brewing above the dark tower was set loose. Jonathan turned to see hundreds of red energy bolts flying up into the atmosphere from the top of the tower, before streaking down towards him. The attack blanketed a wide area, and there was no apparent way to avoid it. Jonathan would have to protect Edgar with his body. It would tax his already damaged armor to its limits, but if he managed to limit his contact with the energy, he could possibly make it out of this mostly unhurt. Jonathan shook his head a moment later. Who was he kidding? This was going to hurt a lot. Jonathan could feel the energy building behind him, empowering itself through merging its many parts. When it would hit with the force of a cannonball, or perhaps even more. It was nowhere near as powerful as the attack that had been leveled at them the previous day, but it was still enough to kill Jonathan if it all hit him at once. Granath was still on the ground, looking up at the two men with a grin on his grotesque features. They were already over the wall separating the main city from the center, but they were still within his domain. The worm slapped his tail onto the ground, and a nearby building shifted into a tentacle of stone and metal, stretching up into the sky to grasp at Jonathan and Edgar. The two men jerked to the side, and the tentacle followed, trying to grasp them before they could avoid the rain of red spears. Granath was quite physically weak for his level, which wasn't really saying much, but his magical power was off the charts. He was only about 2 or 3 times stronger than Jonathan physically, but his total destructive capability was far higher. Edgar was desperately manipulating his control over the wind to move the two men out of the way of the encroaching tentacle of rock and metal, and for a few moments, it appeared as if they were successful. Then Granath grunted, and summoned another rocky tendril, sending it in pursuit of the two men. Jonathan gritted his teeth and sent his awareness out into the world around him, trying to usurp Granath's magical control over the rock and metal that made up the tendrils trying to grab them. It was like trying to push a boulder up a mountain, but Jonathan managed to slow the tentacles down somewhat with his newfound control over his elemental energy, courtesy of discovering his little trick with conceptual resonance. Elemental energy was not like mana, and it was almost flavored in a way towards the overarching desire for the element. His void element wanted to destroy all it touched, and he could use that desire to his advantage if he was clever enough about it. It was like holding a very large dog on a leash who was too strong to control fully. You would have to use its desires to make it do what you wanted. In this case, his void mana filled that role well enough, and the mana threaded through the rocky tentacles was enough for it to race towards them, looking for an easy meal. However, this slowed down Edgar's flight skill, without Jonathan supporting it anymore, and the red energy bolts neared them. Soon, they would make contact, no matter how fast they were going. Edgar had a sudden flash of inspiration however, and he swooped around one of the tentacles, almost hitting it in the process. The bolts of red light tried to curve around the tentacle, but they were too slow, and about a quarter of them impacted the rocky tendril, shattering it. Their energy expended, the bolts of light that had struck the rock faded away. However, there were still hundreds left, and their odds had barely gone up at all. Granath quickly established control over the rock around him again, sending up spears of stone, heedless of the damage he was causing. This was his city, and it was his to do as he saw fit with. 30-foot-long lances of rock shot up into the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, taxing Edgar's concentration. In addition, the other tendril of rock was still there, and it kept coming closer and closer to the two men. As well as all that, the wave of red light was still following them. Edgar would run out of mana eventually, and when that happened, they would be dead, or even worse, captured by Granath. Screams erupted from the people below them as the spears of rock came crashing to the earth, destroying buildings and digging long furrows into the streets. People ran for cover, but did not find any, as the stone spears were too large to be denied. Only a nearby dwarven district was left mostly unscathed, as its buildings were all underground. You can't run forever, Jonathan. Your friend will eventually run out of mana, and then you will be mine. The situation was becoming worse and worse by the second, and Jonathan could not see any way out. He could not use smite for a while, without killing himself in the process, not that it would do much anyway. The only thing that he could think of was using his runes, but he didn't know how they would apply to his situation. He started to search through his various skill runes, trying to find one that would be useful to his purposes. In the very center of his Touch of Decay skill matrix, there was a rune that looked promising. It looked like a spiral, leading into an infinite abyss. He started to create it in the real world, inscribing it onto his flesh with one of the spikes on his gauntlet. It hurt, but not that much. A moment later, a powerful suction erupted out from the rune, tearing the nearby mana out of the air and into Jonathan. He screamed as he felt white-hot energy entering his body, and he fought to keep himself from canceling the rune. It was working the way that he had intended. The nearby tendril of rock started to crumble apart, and the spears of light lost some of their luster. He was rapidly losing health at this point, one of the reasons to not simply pull runes out of nowhere without testing them first. A notification blossomed in front of him, but he pushed it away for now. That could wait until he had gotten out of here. More and more mana entered his body like a tide of blue acid, scorching his skin and the very fabric of his being. The mana bar on his stat sheet started to tick up above its normal maximum, burgeoning at an impossible speed. His core began to crack, but Jonathan slammed his will down on it, desperately fighting to compress it back into its normal shape. He could feel his pathway skill increasing as he did so, but the thought was useless to him at the moment. He had been unable to mitigate the effects of the rune, and now it was expressing itself to the utmost with the confines of his divinity stat, which meant that all he could do was enjoy the ride. His mana core kept almost breaking, but he managed to keep it running with his own willpower, and the pain was getting to the point where he could barely keep track of anything around him. He could feel the rune starting to devour his flesh in its pursuit of mana, seeking to tear apart his very body for the mana that it contained. However, Jonathan started to desperately offload his divinity into the world around him, trying to head off his rune's source of fuel. A few moments later, the rune cut off and Jonathan was left there, gasping, as Edgar floated them away. Luckily the rune had been pointed away from the duo, with Jonathan's body protecting Edgar, or else the flying spell would have been interrupted by it. As it was, they were in the sky with no obstacles for the moment, and a raging Granath hurling curses at them from the Citadel. The worm kept sending more and more earth spears after them, but they were too far away now, and they only landed in the city, dealing more damage. The tower started to charge up another strike, but it was too late, and the two men quickly dropped to the ground, far enough away from the center of the city to run the rest of the way out. As they landed in the middle of a street, the people around them scattered, likely seeing them as heralds of the destruction that Granath had caused earlier. That was just fine for them. What in Malaraxia's spear was that? Edgar exclaimed, using the name of some god unfamiliar to Jonathan in his oath. Something that I should have practiced with first, Jonathan replied, not wanting to give away too much to Edgar. He trusted the man, but there are things that he could not trust anyone else, no matter how close they were to him. In the future, he would hopefully look back on that decision with a sense of pride in himself for resisting the urge. Edgar shook his head in amazement, and the two men started to run out of the city, trying to get their headings. Seeing as none of them had actually seen the city on the way in, they had to rely on what they had seen during their brief time in the air to get out. The entire city was on alert, and barely a moment later, alarms started to ring across the entire place, with soldiers bursting out of garrisons across the entire city. Mages floated through the sky in hot pursuit, but none of them were fast enough to catch up with the running speed of the two men. As they ran, Jonathan inspected his notifications. You have learned the rune of consumption. This rune, powered by divinity, will draw upon its conceptual nature to devour all mana within its radius of effect, and deliver it into whatever medium the rune is inscribed upon. You can upgrade this rune to devour more substances by furthering your understanding of it. The radius, and the power of the rune, depends on the amount of divinity placed into it. There were a few more notifications too, all of which were skill notifications. First up was one for his runecrafting skill. You have reached apprentice rank 3 with runecrafting. You have furthered your understanding of the runes by adding yet another one to your arsenal, and actually surviving the effects of an untrammeled, untested rune. You showed you metal by plucking a rune out of a skill matrix and bringing it into the outside world without any sort of preparation. Such skills are impressive, but also highly dangerous. Plus 10 to intelligence, plus 5 to wisdom. You have access to a skill. Rune Savant, Legendary. You have greater control over all runes that you make, as well as their effects. Runes will do less damage to you if you are caught in their area of effect, and will be more effective overall. This skill also increases the rate at which you can learn new runes. Accept. Y/N. The skill was a no-brainer, and Jonathan instantly hit yes, delivering yet another legendary skill into his tank. After runecrafting was one for True Sight. You have reached apprentice rank 1 with True Sight. In refining your ability to sense runes, you have managed to pluck one straight out of a skill matrix, almost killing yourself in the process. You have shown that your talent for seizing upon new and unfamiliar runes is dangerously potent. Be sure not to kill yourself in the process. +10 to wisdom, +5 to intelligence. There was no skill option here, but Jonathan didn't really need one in any case. Hearing a shout, he briefly closed his interface, spotting a small group of guards heading their way. Jonathan started to direct the overflow of mana in his core towards his hands, coating them with a thick layer of condensed mana that he shaped into twin swords of light. As the soldiers approached, he burst forwards, and slashed out with the swords, expelling the excess mana. Two crescents of energy erupted out of his hands, bisecting the nearby soldiers with their potency. Jonathan kept running, with Edgar following in his wake. The next notification was actually relevant to what he had just done, one for his mana manipulation abilities. You have reached Apprentice rank 5 with mana manipulation. His efforts to keep his core in check, as well as smaller bonuses that had piled up over the last few days, had left him with quite a bit of progress towards the next tier of mastery. Finally, there was notification for his control over the void. You have reached 5% mastery over the element of void. Jonathan quickly closed his interface, and focused on running. With all of his dexterity, he was quite good at it. However, the city just kept on going, for dozens, or perhaps even hundreds of miles, and even at his speed, it would take some time to get out. There was no question of them staying in the city, such a decision was a death sentence. They need to level up and reach Tier 2 before they could even think of coming back, which meant that they need to head towards the rim, the edge of this world where the strongest beasts lived. Nowhere else would they find the necessary essence to achieve their goals. Edgar had been unable to regain his lost equipment, but Jonathan had told the man about the dungeon, where he could gain something even better than his old equipment. That would be their first stop when they left this place, and the trip would hopefully be quicker than before. As they ran, the city started to blur around them, and the soldiers blocking their way became commonplace, more obstacles to be dispatched with alacrity. The floating mages were a different problem, however, and they rained down spells on the two men, forcing them to take circuitous routes to avoid the strikes. However, none of them dared to engage them on the ground, not wanting to test their spells against Jonathan's new rune, which had been able to defeat Granath's mana itself. Back in the palace, Granath raged, throwing his massive bulk against the stone pillars of the building, causing it to shake. He was being thwarted by mere ants, and it galled him. Granath was unable to pursue them, however, because of his immense power. He had long outgrown the soft limiter for this circle, and as a result, the mana was too low to support him. He had been forced to order a mana recycler from a lower circle and had it installed within his palace, so that he could survive. He could only last for about 15 minutes out of its effect before his strength vastly decreased, and he could not afford to project any sort of weakness to his citizens. Because of this, he had been forced to send his forces out after Jonathan and the other man, whose name Granath did not know, and did not care to know. For the first time in millennia, someone was getting the better of him. The last time anyone had even harmed him was when that accursed would-be hero had tried to usurp him all those years ago. The man had somehow reached Tier 2, which should have been impossible for anyone not aligned with Granath. He had entered the Ashen Citadel, destroying its legions with ease, before challenging Granath himself. The majority of the wounds that he possessed were from that fight, and he now had a new one to add to the litany of scars, the one that Jonathan had left. Of course the wound had not been actually dealt by Jonathan, rather by that amulet that he had possessed, but it still counted in Granath's mind. He would have his revenge soon enough in any case. The ash heaps were his domain, and the vast majority of his armies were spread across the land, rather than simply being in the capital. Millions of soldiers roamed this world, and all of them would be coming after Jonathan soon enough. Granath sighed, and stopped indulging in his rage, instead slithering over to his most prized possession, the suit of armor and sword that the hero had worn all while fighting him. They were nondescript pieces of equipment, but they were both Tier 2, spiritual weapons that the man had somehow transported to the hells with him after dying in Telvaria. Granath had never been to the real world, but he eventually hoped, like all circle rulers, to be granted a leave of absence. So far however his own weakness stymied his efforts to advance. Granath closed his eyes and contemplated his place in the universe for the next half-hour, sitting in blissful silence, undisturbed by the noises of his servants outside. He might have been a monster, utterly alien to any person, but he still had the mind of the being that he once had been, a lowly human groveling in the dirt before the sublime might of his master, Angranor. The circle rulers were locked in an endless cycle of stagnation, where to progress, one had to defeat the circle ruler above them in power, which was quite a hard thing to do. They could challenge one another at any time, dueling in front of the entire infernal court, but it was considered to be quite a fruitless affair, as it was almost impossible to defeat someone more powerful than you. Sure, their levels were equalized, but the more powerful fighter still had the advantage of all of their skills and titles, which meant that they were often far more powerful than the challenger. Granath had been gathering strength ever since his last disastrous duel against the lord of the next circle, Slothari. The circle below the ash heaps was known as Mire, and it was a land of endless decay and rot that extended for thousands of miles in the form of a vast swamp. The monsters that dwelt within it were all uniquely nasty creatures, and their lord was no better. Slothari was a giant pulsating ball of slime that wielded far greater power than her ridiculous shape would entail. In general, the circle lords became more humanoid the further one delved into the hells, striving to become more aligned with their maker, Angranor. Only the rulers of the last 9 circles had ever met their king in the flesh, and Granath knew that he would never have the opportunity. He was the laughingstock of the circle lords, and that was the only thing that kept him going sometimes. Granath clenched his jaw and looked upon the suit of armor, reminding himself of his own power, no matter how many layers there were to go until he could reach the bottom of the hells. It was partly the fault of this realm why he could not chase after Jonathan Harlow, because as the first realm of the hells, this one was built to contain tier 1s and tier 2s, and was the only circle with such variance in its minimum and maximum power levels. Tier 1 mana was far weaker than any subsequent tier of mana, and as a result it was hard-pressed to support fighters above a certain level. It had been different in ages past, when there were fewer tier 2s, and Granath fondly remembered laying waste to Patrolena City thousands of years ago, but the number of people in the realm had skyrocketed recently. This variance was because of the fact that the differences inside of tiers grew exponentially the higher one got, but it still meant that Granath was heavily constrained after having reached the pinnacle of what was allowed. To grow further, to reach the tier 3 status that he had been ready for all these years, he would need to defeat Slothari and send the ash heaps to the second place among the hells. When a circle ruler beat another one, their entire circle came with them, rather than them simply taking over the role of the other circle ruler. It was a strange system, but in the few cases when it actually happened, it was easier than having to reset all of the administrative systems. Feeling a little bit better, Granath withdrew from the trophies, and set up a mental communication link with his generals out in the ash, alerting them to the presence of an invader, and sending them a detailed report on Jonathan Harlow. None of them responded, but he knew that they had received the information already. Armies started to amass out in the world, and Granath smiled. One way or another, Jonathan could not hide forever. Jonathan and Edgar were flagging now, their stamina bars starting to give out. The city just kept on going, and after almost an hour of non-stop running, they still had not reached the end. The only upside of all this was that the soldiers chasing them had run out of stamina as well, and the mages flying up above had run out of mana to propel their flight. In addition, the guards stationed in these parts of the city were far weaker than the ones stationed in the center, meaning that they were trivial to evade. Eventually, after another 10 minutes of running, the 2 men finally saw the end of the city. It was surrounded by a vast wall, made to keep the monsters out, and that wall was summited by hundreds of various artillery pieces that were thankfully pointed outwards. They would still have to deal with those when they escaped however. The 2 men made a beeline for the nearest gate, a giant construction of ebony wood, and sped past the nearby guards, shocking them with their speed. Jonathan cocked back his fist and gathered his remaining power to it, relying more on his mana and elemental energy than his physical strength, as he was tapped out, and drove it into the gate, sending his mana straight through the fibers of the wood. With his new mastery over his mana, such a feat was possible, and the wood ruptured beneath his fist, exploding outwards in a spray of splinters. The resulting hole was large enough for him to get through, and he quickly vaulted through it, allowing Edgar to follow. They were finally out of the city. Jonathan set foot onto Black Ash for the first time in days, and started running for it, wanting to get out of the range of the siege engines before they could fire. Edgar quickly caught up to him, and the two men raced off into the distance as the ballistas and catapults began to discharge their loads. They were free. Over the next 2 weeks, the two men got to know one another far better than before, and they both shared their life stories as they ran, with only Jonathan excluding a few bits about his brushes with the system and the runes. They had kept to the ash heaps, staying away from population centers, and relying on monsters for essence. It was a lonely existence, but it was leagues better than Jonathan's first few weeks in this world, now that he had a companion. The simple comfort of just having someone to talk to had been painfully absent for Jonathan. It was hard to be hunted down by an entire world without any sort of company. Edgar had only elaborated a bit on his life as a prince of a system-integrated world a bit, but it was still quite intriguing, and Jonathan had found out more about the politics of a world where power determined the hierarchy of life. People like Edgar were like filth on the bottom of a higher power's shoe, and they were treated as such, left to live their own miserable existence in tiny allotments of land set apart for them. There was a common saying among the denizens of Telvaria which went something like this: "Better to be a tier 10 slave than to be a tier 1 king." It was a phrase that was highly indicative of the way that the world worked, and Edgar had assured him that a tier 10 slave would actually be better treated than a tier 1 king in reality. The two men did a lot more than talk, however, and most of their time was spent fighting with the various monsters of the Ash, and a few guard patrols as well. Jonathan reached level 75 by the end of the 2-week period, as well as improving his elemental mastery to 7%, and Edgar had reached level 72, both men reaching ever closer to tier 2. Neither of them knew what exactly breaking through to the next tier meant, but Edgar assured Jonathan that it wasn't as simple as simply gaining another level. There was an intricate process to it, one that Edgar had only heard stories about. It was a process that he had never expected to go through. At the peak of tier 1, one had a lifespan of around 200 years, which was barely enough in Telvaria to get anywhere, unless you were very lucky indeed. Jonathan had gotten a better picture of his companion's abilities as well, finding out the man's class and specialization. Edgar was a class variant of an air mage who specialized in utility spells. He lacked heavy-hitting attacks, but he had invested heavily in his physical stats to avoid that. As a result of his noble upbringing, he had been able to raise his class to a higher level, meaning that he gained more stat points per level up than the basic mage class. Apparently, such things were perfectly possible, and one only had to seek out rare reagents or defeat sufficiently powerful monsters to upgrade their basic class. A class was apparently a milestone of where your path was going, and as a result, there was quite a bit of free reign within the first tier to pick your specialization. If you wanted to become a spellsword, using mana and weapons in equal measure, then good for you. If you wanted to ply the depths of elemental power, well, you could also do that. In any case, Jonathan had missed all of that as a result of his outsider class, which was already unreasonably powerful. However, it was not as powerful as he had thought. He still gained more stat points per level than most, but a few classes existed that were even more powerful than his own. However, he possessed a myriad of other bonuses as well, such as his divinity, his runes and his titles, all of which were far more powerful than they should have been. Of course, Edgar did not know about the first two ones, thinking that they were mere skills. In addition, Jonathan had focused on raising his pathway skills as well, trying to upgrade his mana manipulation to the next rank. He had only managed to raise it by 2 tiers in the time, bringing it up to 7, but all of the progress that he could make was welcome. He sensed that the next tier of mastery would come if he managed to increase his control over external mana manipulation, as he had been able to do earlier. He had force-fed concentrated insight into his skill through the compression of his core, and surviving the onslaught of mana from his rune, but he sensed that he had skipped a few steps, which was why he had gained so much experience out of it. In trying to control his external mana, he was able to increase his power in a much safer way. He had not tried to use his rune again in the last few weeks, fearful of its dangers. Jonathan paused on the top of an ash drift and pulled out the map, comparing the landmarks to those around him. They were getting close to the dungeon. The ship that had carried Jonathan off to the city had done so far faster than he had thought, and they had been quite far indeed from the dungeon. Having to wait for Edgar's slower pace had meant that he had sacrificed speed, but seeing as the whole point of coming to the dungeon was for Edgar's sake, it was fine. An hour later, both men were standing about 5 miles away from the dungeon, having had to sneak around the thousands of soldiers in the area, whose numbers had only seemed to rise since Jonathan's last visit here. He could never have tried this if not for the fact that nobody could follow someone into the dungeon once it was started, which meant that they would be mostly safe. Even better, if they were quick enough about it, which was possible given Jonathan's newfound power since last having been here, they would be able to get in and out without being noticed. He was back at full strength by now, having gotten over the long-lasting effects of his damaged body, the result of having supercharged his smite ability. He could use it again now without fear of death, but it was still a last resort option. In any case, he was hardly going to need it here. "Ready?" Jonathan asked Edgar as the two men surveyed the dungeon and the surrounding land. "That I am, Jonathan. That I am." Jonathan had started to become more used to the vaguely archaic manner of speaking that his friend had, and he simply nodded in response. They started down the ash heap a moment later, heading towards the dungeon entrance. The circling patrols were nowhere near them at the moment, and they quickly made their way down to the familiar front of the dungeon. The actual dungeon itself appeared to be abandoned, and there were no soldiers near them. The lip of rock that protected the back of the dungeon was still there, and Jonathan headed for it, wary of lurking guards. However, nobody sprang out to meet them. Even before, the security had been quite lax, but this was something else. Jonathan had a bad feeling about this, but he quelled it for now. The benefits that this would bring were too great. He had gained so much in his own run of the dungeon, and he was confident that Edgar could get a lot out of it as well. Seeing as the dungeon scaled to the levels of its challengers, it would incorporate his level and power, meaning that he would be able to power level both himself and Edgar. As they neared the small hill of rock that made up the entrance to the dungeon, Edgar frowned. "This seems quite small to contain all of the wonders that you spoke of earlier. Are you sure this is the right place?" "No, I have not. Dungeons are quite rare indeed, and their use is reserved for the strongest of beings, at least back on Telvaria. Someone like me would never have gotten a slot in one of them. The wait lists alone could extend for years. But, I trust your judgment. You were here before, after all." Jonathan nodded and kept walking, leading Edgar towards the back of the dungeon towards the entrance. Soon they were standing in front of the lip of rock that protected the back side of the dungeon, and Edgar stared up at it. Jonathan began to climb immediately, and Edgar started to levitate up towards the top, alighting on the upper part of the rock as Jonathan arrived. The two men leaped over the edge and landed in front of the dungeon itself, heading over to the pitch-black entrance hole. Jonathan nodded at Edgar, and then took a step in. Edgar followed a moment later. They were not sure of the window of opportunity for a party to cross into the dungeon together, so they had decided to do it pretty much in unison. A moment later, Jonathan was standing in the middle of a tunnel of rock that was quite familiar. It looked similar to the tunnel that had contained the Terran wolves before. But it had a different air to it, and it felt more dangerous. A moment later, Edgar popped into existence next to Jonathan, stumbling slightly as he landed on the unfamiliar floor of the dungeon. A few seconds later, a notification popped up in front of the two men, visible to both of them at the same time, which was strange. "Your party has entered the Desolation Caves, a dungeon of the Infinite Hells. This dungeon is an adaptive dungeon, meaning that it will change its difficulty to match the average level of challengers. As you are in a party, this dungeon will be matched to your average level. Error. This challenger party is significantly stronger than their level suggests. Calculating new difficulty level. The average level of this dungeon has been set to level 80. Jonathan raised an eyebrow at the message, interested in how this would play out. The difficulty level had risen since last time by almost 20 levels, which was certainly too much for Edgar alone to take on. With Jonathan, however, this would be doable. He had not gained anything near 20 levels since he was here the last time, but he had easily gained the power of those levels regardless. A moment later another notification popped up, one that was mainly for Edgar's benefit, as Jonathan had already been here. This dungeon manifests as a large cave system, with a great expanse of tunnels all leading towards the final boss fight, which is in the center. Monsters within this dungeon will adjust to the average level, rather than simply being at the level indicated. As a result, they can range from level 70 to all the way to level 90. The boss itself will be even stronger. Good luck. Jonathan gave Edgar a nod, and the two men started down the tunnel in silence. As they walked, Jonathan kept an eye out for the Terran wolves, but when the first monster attacked, it was of a completely different species. A massive spider dropped down from the ceiling, its bulbous body and hairy legs causing Jonathan to withdraw in disgust. The creature hissed at him, prompting Jonathan to surge forwards, driving his fist into its open jaw, which was lined with hundreds of sharp fangs. The monster was clearly not an average spider, as its mouth structure was completely different, added to the fact that it was far too large. The monster was propelled backwards, falling into the twisting wall of the cave, where it lay, twitching slightly. The monster was still not dead, however, and Jonathan nodded at Edgar, prompting the man to go forwards and finish it off. They could both gain essence from fights if they participated in them together, and Edgar quickly finished the beast off with a blade of wind, bisecting the monster's head, taking advantage of the wound that Jonathan had left. Essence entered the two men in waves, more than they had been able to gain recently. Jonathan smiled, and kept walking, catching up with Edgar. Neither man spoke, afraid that their voices would alert the monsters to their presence. In any case, they hardly had anything to speak about, as much of their available lines of idle conversation were depleted from their trek through the ash heaps outside. Besides, it wasn't exactly the time or place for such things anyway. Over the next hour, they made their way down the tunnel. Jonathan quickly found that it was far longer than it had been the first time around. In increasing its level, the dungeon had also increased its size to match. More and more monsters skittered towards them every passing minute, and soon they were beset on all sides by the monstrous arachnids, which forced Jonathan to start taking this entire thing more seriously. He started to bring out this elemental energy and mana, and Edgar began to use his more powerful skills, sending super-accelerated chunks of rock at supersonic speed toward his opponents, using his mastery over the air to create powerful wind tunnels to do so. Essence poured into them in waves, and both men gained a few levels from their fights, taking them up to 74 for Edgar, and 76 for Jonathan. They were so close in level that their level-ups almost coincided sometimes, which was a bonus, as they both healed at the same rate. The spiders contained a nasty paralytic venom in their fangs that, while unable to penetrate Jonathan's armor, had been able to affect Edgar. It was a dangerous venom, and its effects began almost immediately, causing the sufferer to lock up, easy prey for the monsters. It wore off naturally, but leveling up also cleansed it too. Jonathan wondered why the initial formatting of the dungeon layout had been changed, and whether the rest of it would be different as well. The actual tunnels were the same though, which meant that it was likely only the monsters that had been changed here. A while later, they broke out of the tunnels and into the cavern that had been filled with the troglodytes last time. To Jonathan's relief, it was exactly the same. At least he knew how to deal with this area. Alright, Edgar. This cavern is populated by a sort of goblinoid creature known as a troglodyte. There are a few different castes of their race, of which the warriors are the most dangerous. With the added level since last time though, they might have additional skills and abilities. In addition, the top priority is killing their spiritual leader, as he will summon a powerful golem otherwise. This is an interesting dungeon layout. The ones that I read about were not like this, at least the ones at the first tier. The latter tiered dungeons grow exponentially in size, but this one is already quite large. It is quite strange. Read about. Were there books about dungeons back on Telvaria? Jonathan wasn't sure why he was saying back on Telvaria, as it wasn't like he had been born there or anything, but Edgar's manner of speech was rubbing off on him. The palace that I lived in had a gargantuan library, with tens of thousands of books. I spent much of my childhood in there, looking for books to further my spellcraft. I sometimes delved into the adventuring section too though, and read a few primers on the subject. Unfortunately, I never managed to use any of the information, beyond the basic part. My father never let me adventure alone, instead trying to level me with the help of his guards. He was the only tier 2 in the land, and his word was law. Ha! What did those primers say exactly? It might be useful to know. Most of them were just about the common monsters of the land, which doesn't really apply here. However, the one about dungeoneering said that a normal tier 1 dungeon is about 2 miles across. We've already traveled that far at least. How much more is there to go? After this cavern there is quite a bit of ground to cover. Maybe another 5 miles. Jonathan replied as the two men started into the cavern. That's strange indeed. That borders on a tier 2 dungeon. Maybe that is because it's an adaptive dungeon. Perhaps, Jonathan said, before lapsing into silence. The two men traveled through the first segment of the cavern in a matter of minutes, running across the stone floor through the strange shrubs that covered the ground. A few minutes later, they encountered their first troglodyte, a hulking specimen of muscle and flesh that held a massive stone club. It was larger than the troglodytes that Jonathan had seen last time, which meant that it was far more powerful, on account of its higher level. It was not only higher level, it was larger as well, and more imposing. In addition, its weapon was of a higher quality. It was the perfect monster to test Jonathan's new power on. He signaled for Edgar to remain behind, and sprang forwards, imbuing his fist with mana and divinity. Purple and red light blossomed around his hands, and he drove his right hand towards the monster's undefended side. The creature whirled around, far faster than Jonathan had expected, and managed to get its club in the way of his strike. His gauntlets clashed with the sword briefly, before shattering the stone and sending his fist into the creature's jaw. The monster tumbled backwards, blood exploding out of its mouth, and Jonathan followed up with a kick that flipped the monster onto its back. He landed on top of it, and sent his fist down into the creature's stomach, tearing into its weak underbelly. He pulsed his energy through his hand's flash, frying the monster's insides. It flailed around, slamming its massive arms into his body, rattling his bones. The strikes were powerful, and bruises formed on his side. However, he was mostly unharmed on account of his armor. Soon the monster died, and essence flooded into him, giving him another level. These troglodytes were on another level. Edgar ran up to Jonathan's side, surveying the creature in front of him. What an odd creature. Are they truly sapient or are they merely dungeon facsimiles? Probably the latter, given by what I saw last time. However, I had to fight their leader later on in the dungeon, and he was much more intelligent. I almost felt guilty about killing him. However, he was trying to kill me, so I suppose it was just as well. Interesting. Dungeons rarely have intelligent creatures as denizens, at least at this level. Well, yeah. This is a pretty abnormal dungeon. That much is clear now, Jonathan answered, stepping over the hulking mass of the monster's corpse. Now, if I remember right, there are some valuable mushrooms on the right-hand cave wall. I already partook of them, but you should use them. They grant boosts to your stats. However, it might be different this time. Edgar nodded, and walked with Jonathan, heading towards the cavern wall in the distance. Jonathan could not tell especially well, but it seemed as if the cavern was larger than it had been last time, and the wall was smaller in his vision than he had remembered. They reached it about 10 minutes later, moving at a normal human speed so as to not draw attention, and Jonathan started to circle it, searching for the mushrooms. He found a patch of them some time later. Jonathan plucked one of them free and threw it to Edgar, prompting the man to catch it with a tendril of air that extended from his left hand. Looking at Jonathan askance, he watched as he mimed eating. Edgar nodded and took a bite out of the mushroom, gagging slightly at the foul taste and at the poison within it. He choked down the rest, and then grinned as he read the resulting notification. Edgar ran over to the wall and started to devour the mushrooms, motivated in the same way that Jonathan had been. Power was quite an effective means of making one do something distasteful. Jonathan started to shovel the mushrooms into his storage device, glad that he was equipped to harvest them now. Last time, he had missed out on the no doubt valuable mushrooms. Jonathan stored away the ones that Edgar did not use, and soon they had depleted the entire stock between them, with Edgar looking quite nauseous now from his experience. However, he had likely gained a significant amount of power from that, at least for someone who was spec towards his mental abilities, and he seemed to be happy enough about it. Once the man had recovered, Jonathan and Edgar stepped back into the shrubland that made up most of the cavern, ready to keep fighting. Other than the levels of the monsters in the cavern, the layout was exactly the same, and they butchered their way through the troglodytes over the next hour and a half, gaining levels rapidly. The leveling speed started to slow down once Jonathan reached level 80, but the essence was still worthwhile. Edgar was also leveling rapidly, and all of his skills were getting a good workout from the battles. He had never fought against such strong enemies before, and won, so this was quite informative for him, both on his own strength, and what he could improve. Jonathan of course had little to no trouble with the individual troglodytes, and only started to take damage when they came in groups. However, with the rapid leveling speed, almost all of the injuries that he took healed within no time at all. The two men had embarked upon this journey by making a circuit around the cavern, slowly wiping out every monster that they found. Eventually, they were left in front of the village, where a scant handful of troglodytes waited, far less than there had been the last time Jonathan was here. That meant that the troglodyte leader would find it harder to summon the rocky monstrosity that he had last time. Edgar, go for the grunts, and distract them. I'll finish off the leader, Jonathan instructed the other man, as he started to sneak into the village. Edgar nodded, bowing to Jonathan's superior knowledge of this dungeon, and went the other way, masking his footsteps with the power of the wind. Jonathan waited a few moments behind a crude hut, and when he heard shouts of anger coming from the village he raced in, and towards the central troglodyte. This time the monster wielded a large staff, one that seemed to be made to conduct mana more effectively. Upon seeing Jonathan, the creature snarled and pointed the staff at him, expelling a bolt of lightning at him. The bolt seared through the air and impacted his armor, moving faster than he could hope to dodge. He gritted his teeth as the electricity moved through his body, but he ultimately ignored it, surging towards the monster in front of him. The troglodyte slammed its staff on the ground, and a wall of yellow energy rose up around it, stopping Jonathan's strike in his tracks. He might have been strong for this dungeon, but he was still a bit underleveled, and this showed as he was unable to break through the shield. However, that was only accounting for his raw force, and he sent a spike of void mana into the shield, which brought it down soon enough. A few vicious punches later, the monster was dead, and Jonathan ran off to help Edgar, who was dancing around a dozen troglodytes, trying desperately not to die. The man was giving as good as he got, but he was already quite injured, and only the speed from his elemental mastery was keeping him alive. Jonathan tore through the monsters before they had even noticed him, each sweeping blow of his fists cracking bones and shattering limbs. However, they quickly acclimated to his presence, and half of the monsters split off, trying to keep him at bay while the others dealt with the annoying pest that was Edgar. Jonathan slammed his hands together, causing purple energy to spark around them, and started to play around with his mana, elongating the spikes on the gauntlet that he wore with his purple energy. With weapons that now extended a foot forwards, he punched towards the nearest troglodyte, skewering it on his mana. With a quick gesture, the mana exploded, blasting apart the monster's abdomen. Upon seeing this, the others grew more cautious, and they circled Jonathan, keeping their distance until they could strike. However, Jonathan had no time for these games, and simply exploded into motion, slamming his fists into the nearby monsters with wild abandon. Edgar would be overrun soon, and Jonathan needed to save him. With a few void-coated punches, Jonathan was out of the fray, and he charged towards Edgar, bowling over the troglodytes that surrounded him, a ridiculous sight, given their size. However, Jonathan was far stronger than he should have been, and as a result, he sent the massive beasts flying as he ran into them. Jonathan stood by Edgar and used his superior strength to support his ally, blasting away the monster with each punch. Edgar used his wind powers to slice at the monsters with blades of air, and he used it to enhance Jonathan's movements. The two men made short work of the remaining monsters, and soon they had finished, having slain all of the troglodytes. With another level under their belt, bringing Jonathan up to 81, they were ready to continue. Jonathan only remembered the mana angler at the last moment, and he decided to take a detour with Edgar to kill it. Last time it had been stronger than the normal monsters, which meant that it would be quite rewarding to kill. Eventually finding the same pool as last time, Jonathan neared it, pretending that he had fallen under the spell of the monster. As the creature started to rise, seeking an easy meal, Jonathan drew power to his fist, using both his runic energy and his mana. His fist blazed with light and he punched the monster as it rose, cracking the stony layer that surrounded it. The monster squealed in rage and lashed out with a tentacle of mana, trying to crush him. Edgar sent a blade of air up towards it, lopping off the fragile limb, before summoning a spear of gusting wind to his hand, throwing it towards the crack in the beast's stony armor. There was a thud, and the spear struck home, changing form to slice through the gap. The monster bled heavily from the hole and it changed targets to Edgar, flailing around wildly. The monster had devolved into simple animal instinct at this point, and it barely seemed to notice Jonathan's presence. In response, Jonathan stepped forwards and gathered power in his hand, creating a spear of void mana in his hands that grew in power the longer he held it. With a roar, he surged forwards and thrust the spear into the monster, sinking deep. It froze, and Jonathan detonated the spear, causing a large chunk of the creature to explode in a shower of watery slime. He stepped back as the monster wheeled towards him, trying to destroy him before it died. Edgar rose above it on pinions of semi-transparent air, and sent bolts of concentrated elemental energy from on high, further damaging the monster. The creature hissed and Jonathan moved in, skewering it on another spear of light. He still preferred to use his fists in battle, but sometimes a bit of range was nice. He was trying to work towards some sort of projectile attack with his mana, which would open up his options a bit. He was nowhere near that level now, but he hoped to gain something along those lines when he ranked up to the next tier of mastery. Perhaps something higher than legendary rarity. For now though, this was sufficient. Jonathan poked at the creature with his spear, gradually growing more adept at controlling it. Soon he was able to control the explosion somewhat, using up only the tip of the spear, using the rest as a channel for his mana. This greatly increased his power, and the monster was soon dead, in a heap of jelly-like liquid. Essence entered him and Edgar, propelling Edgar up another level. Unfortunately, Jonathan did not gain one. However, both men were coming closer and closer to Tier 2, which would be a huge boost to their power. Jonathan banished his spear, letting the ichor on it fall to the ground. Edgar dropped from the sky, his wings disappearing. The two men were finished with the first section of the dungeon, eager to discover the rest of its secrets. The next section of the dungeon was the same as it had been before, a tunnel that sloped down to a massive lake of lava, populated by monsters. However, the lake was larger this time, and in the very center there was a small island with a tree on it, a tree that glowed with a faint light. However, far more shapes circled under the lava around the lake. In addition, the series of islands that crossed the lake came nowhere near the island. This was not the same layout as it had been, in many ways harder than it had been when Jonathan had plumbed the depths of this dungeon. He told Edgar as much, prompting a look of suspicion from the man at the dungeon's irregular behavior. In any case, the tree at the center burned brightly to his spiritual sense, and he could sense that whatever was there was valuable. There was no indication of what it was, but it seemed like something that would be worthwhile to pursue. Jonathan started towards the edge of the lake, and then realized that he had an easy cheat for this section of the dungeon. "Edgar, can't you just fly us over?" Jonathan asked, turning to the other man. "I mean, I can try. I am sure that the system would not make it that easy though." Edgar began to rise into the air, but almost immediately a pressure descended on him, forcing him to the ground. He shook his head, and gave Jonathan a disappointed look. "As I suspected. We cannot evade the purpose of this zone that easily." Jonathan nodded grimly and stared ahead at the lava. It looked like they were going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. With a shake of his head, Jonathan leaped towards the first island in the lava, landing securely. Edgar followed a moment later, landing by Jonathan. The monsters stirred in the deep, but none surfaced. However, over the next hour, they did not have such luck, and soon Edgar was covered in burns, the result of not having any armor. Jonathan was far better off, but he had taken the brunt of the physical damage, having blocked the monsters from directly striking his companion. Jonathan could take the hits, but Edgar could not. Still, they were making a good run of it, and they were already a quarter of the way across the lake, having paused periodically for Edgar to regain his stamina. In return, he sped up their passage with various air elemental skills that increased their speed. Soon there would be too little land for them to leap though, which would necessitate for Edgar to ride on Jonathan's back across the lava, an experience that neither of them were looking forward to. As they crossed over onto a ridiculously small lip of rock protruding up from the lava, they found that it was time for them to enact their plan. With a grunt, Jonathan dove into the lava, surfacing a moment later. Compared to when he had done this before, he was far stronger, and the lava didn't even bother him at all. It just felt like warm water to his skin, perhaps even in a pleasant manner if he thought about it. Edgar lowered himself down slowly with his control over the air onto Jonathan's shoulders, and stood there as Jonathan began to paddle out into the lake. Edgar kept an eye out for monsters, and would alert Jonathan if any of them came close enough to harm them. The central island was about 500 feet away from their current position, which was not that far admittedly, but considering their situation, it might as well have been miles. The first monster surfaced barely 10 seconds later, a brute of a lava eel that was covered in spines. The creature hissed at the duo and expelled a cloud of fiery vapors from its mouth, rolling across the lava towards them. Jonathan sent out a field of void mana towards the monster, using every ounce of his mastery to do such a thing. The two clouds of energy met each other, and Jonathan's one siphoned away the power from the cloud, allowing Edgar to dispel it a moment later with a gust of mana-enhanced wind. The eel hissed again and then sank under the lava, heading towards Jonathan underneath the surface of the lake. Jonathan gathered energy to his hands, causing the mana around him to smoke as it was superheated by his skills, and waited until he could sense the monster coming towards him. With his superior senses, he could detect almost anything within a 10-feet radius around himself, and as soon as the monster passed into that area, Jonathan elongated his mana and thrust it into the monster's eyes, which he could feel based on the slightly altered passage of the lava over them. There was a muffled scream and the lava boiled upwards, revealing a seriously angry monster, with bright red blood streaming from its left eye. Jonathan kicked forwards, and ducked under a swipe from its massive head, causing Edgar to exclaim angrily, and hunker down. Droplets of lava were thrown up onto Edgar, but if they hurt him, the man did not show any indication. Instead, he threw a spear of wind into the already wounded eye of the monster, causing it to howl again as the energy bored through the side of its head. With one final attack from Jonathan in the same spot, they broke through to its brain, killing the monster. Its corpse sank beneath the placid surface of the lava lake, and Jonathan continued onwards. They had many other encounters like this along a similar vein, but they made it to the central island eventually, hauling themselves up onto it with sighs of relief. By the end, Jonathan had taken a serious hit to his left arm, and it was almost useless as of now, bent the wrong way. Searing pain shot up and down the limb every time that he jostled it, but he had to deal with it as there was no other option. It would heal itself eventually at any rate. More importantly, the small tree stood in front of them, beckoning to them with tendrils of fiery light that caressed their bodies as they neared. 2 fruits were on the tree, hanging down like droplets of fiery light. They were both ripe and juicy, looking with a sheen on their skin that promised incredible flavor if one bit into them. Jonathan reached down and analyzed the fruit, but nothing happened. He gave Edgar a look, and the man shrugged. "I have never seen anything like this before in my life. Are you sure this is not some elaborate trap?" Edgar said, looking at the fruit in Jonathan's hands. Upon seeing Edgar nod, Jonathan plucked the fruit effortlessly, and then brought it to his lips. Upon taking a bite, he almost let out a groan, the flavor and texture something otherworldly. However, a sudden heat began to blossom in his core, and he felt it intensify until it was blinding. There was no pain, but it was still a disconcerting feeling. A moment later he was falling into an infinite abyss. He awoke a moment later, in a place not where he had been a second ago. He was standing in the middle of a massive foundry, where a stocky dwarf stood in the center, hammering away at a piece of white-hot metal. Every strike stirred up the ambient mana and elemental energy, causing Jonathan to gaze at the man, enraptured. His skin glowed with fiery light, and his eyes were like 2 portals to the surface of the sun, so bright were they. A moment later, the dwarf grunted, and picked up the piece of metal with his bare hands as it began to cool. He thrust out one hand, and heat suddenly blossomed into the world, like the birth of a star. There was no light, simply power, and the metal blazed a brilliant white once more. Jonathan could sense great forces at play here, and he could tell that whoever this dwarf was, he was far more powerful than he was. That man could blast him out of existence with a blink of an eye. As the man started to hammer once more, Jonathan realized that he was in a loop, as the motions were exactly the same. A few moments later, the dwarf picked up the piece of metal once more, and blasted it with pure heat, sending threats of insight into Jonathan's mind. He had no idea what was going on here, but he could sense the beginnings of a skill forming within his mind. Jonathan sunk into a trance, and after watching the vision for the 20th time, he began to mimic the dwarf's movements, seeking to understand the skill that he was using. By the 100th time, he had memorized the motion that the man used, and the only thing left was to find out how to expel the concept of his element out into the air. He could sense that this vision, whatever it was meant to give the user a fire elemental aspect skill, but because of his true affinity, he was unable to use such a skill. However, he could always adapt it. With a grunt, unconsciously mimicking the dwarf, he got to work, beginning to draw upon his elemental energy. He used his Touch of Decay skill as a template, also drawing upon the abilities that his newest rune exhibited. Hundreds of cycles later, Jonathan managed to draw out a tiny amount of pure consumption, causing the air in front of him to implode with a dull thump as his element sucked out the air from the world. The vision whited out with his success, and he was thrust back into the real world. Jonathan slowly rose, noticing that Edgar was lying next to him, in his own vision. A notification awaited him, and he opened it. You have upgraded one of your skills. Touch of Decay, Legendary - Hungering Decay, Mythical. You can now not only use your void elemental energy to unbind spells, but can also use it to devour the very fabric of reality, eating anything that comes into contact with it. At this level, your control over this high-tiered ability is low, but it will grow with time. Apparently that fruit had been some sort of condensed insight into the nature of a skill, that could be adapted into anything that the user desired. As if not, it was not very useful, but Jonathan still tried it out. Closing his eyes, he drew upon the infinite void within him and projected its very nature out into the world, placing his hand against the rock of the island. There was a cracking noise, and a few inches of the rock vanished from existence, pulled into the abyss by his skill. As he grew better with using his elemental energy, the power of the skill could increase. It was already showing great promise, and Jonathan could see where such a skill might lead. He had an image of devouring an entire city with the power of the void, causing it to vanish from existence. However, he was a long way away from that. Edgar awoke with a sputtering gasp beside him, and rose to his feet, gathering the power of the air in his hands. A moment later, he summoned the conceptual energy of his element to his hands, causing the air around them to lose all weight, spreading outwards. It seemed that Edgar had gained his own skill insight as well. What happened in there? Did you see that dwarf at the forge? Jonathan asked. Yes. I can assume that we both experienced the same thing then. Most likely. I gained a skill related to my conceptual energy use, and so did you, it seems. Are you up to test them out? Edgar nodded eagerly, and the two men headed towards the side of the lava lake, Jonathan jumping in first. Edgar landed on his shoulders a moment later, and the two men swam out into the lava at high speeds. As they went, Jonathan tried to consolidate the insights that he had received onto the nature of reality during the vision, realizing that what he had learned could be applied to more than a single skill. In learning that one could draw upon the actual concept that corresponded to their element, Jonathan had just gained a significant weapon in his arsenal. In the future, he could use this to work wonders of destruction. The void was a uniquely powerful element, and Jonathan was looking forward to seeing how it turned out. He could sense that it would be spectacular. A few minutes later, they had reached the nearest island, after having battled a few more of the monsters, gaining another level in the process. They were now past the halfway mark, but not yet in the clear. Jonathan remembered that the lake grew harder and harder to traverse the further that one went. They would need to be careful here. Half an hour later, Jonathan and Edgar were bruised and battered, but had traversed more the lake, navigating the monster-infested waters. Jonathan had come to realize that his new skill, while limited in scope for now, instilled such fear in nearby monsters that the weaker ones would retreat rather than fight him. Seeing the purest form of destruction, there was created terror in the minds of mortals, and these monsters were no different, to the point where it overloaded their system programming, actually making some of them flee. However, the stronger monsters were still able to attack, as some of them were nearing Tier 2 in power. Monstrous fiery eels slithered around the two men, burning them with great exhalations of fiery energy. Strange cetacean creatures surfaced beneath them, trying to swallow them whole, like Jonathan's namesake, Jonah. However, he fended them off, and Edgar picked up the slack. While the man was weaker than Jonathan, he was still an elite among Tier 1s, and he was more than capable of holding his own. Edgar was a man, who if not traveling with Jonathan, would have been the center of his own story. As it was, he was about the equivalent of 20 levels weaker than Jonathan, which, while not that much, was still significant enough to show a clear divide between the two men. Wind was a difficult element to use for offense, and the fact that Edgar was able to damage monsters readily with it showed the power of his elemental connection and his mana. However, the Hells were a breeding ground for the truly powerful, and it seemed that Jonathan had gotten the most out of them. By the time that they had reached the end of the lake, they had left a trail of corpses in their wake, and if the lava had been water, it would have been dyed red with blood. As they reached the shore, the air cracked in front of them, revealing the same demonic creature as had been here last time, except it was a bit larger than before, and wielded a different weapon. This demon held a halberd, one that crackled with dark lightning, centered around its blade. The demon itself was about 10 feet tall and extremely muscular, wearing nothing on its chest. However, its legs were protected by a set of metal plate leggings, and Jonathan frowned at the strange fashion decision. Either this monster was some mess-up on the system's part, or it was sap. "You have come this far, but you will go no further," the demon declared, in a deep, sonorous voice. "You can speak. Edgar replied in shock, his curiosity getting the better of him. Do you think a beast as magnificent as me would be left bereft of sapience? You are a fool. The demon surged forwards a moment later, its halberd held outstretched, ready to slice into someone's flesh. Jonathan got in the way of the strike, letting Edgar fall back, and he parried it with his left gauntlet before sending a straight right into the demon's face. The creature grunted, and weaved around the blow, trying to drive its halberd into Jonathan's side. However, Jonathan moved in, rendering the weapon useless, and headbutt the creature, leaping up to reach its face. The monster stumbled backwards, bleeding heavily, and Jonathan whipped a punch into its abdomen. Behind him, Edgar charged up an attack, and the demon roared, exploding with energy. Red power rose up from its skin, looking like bloody red mist. It pushed Jonathan back with the energy, and then rushed in, heading for Edgar, who it knew to be the weaker of the two. Edgar was ready for it now, however, and a large spear of concentrated wind shot out of his hands, imbued with a tiny bit of his newfound conceptual control. When it struck the demon, the creature was tossed back far further than it should have, as if its body had been lightened by the attack. Edgar dropped his hands, panting, and Jonathan raced after the flying demon, gathering energy into his fist. It glowed with mingled purple and red power, and Jonathan sent a little bit of his conceptual energy into it, which did not create a visible effect, as it was colorless. The demon came down a few seconds later, but Jonathan was ready for it, and he hammered the monster into the ground, detonating the energy surrounding his fist. There was a shockwave, and the creature was blasted down into the stone, creating a large crater. A chunk of its torso was missing, and Jonathan could only attribute that to his new skill. However, the monster thrust up its halberd in the blink of an eye, aiming for the weak spots in his armor from the fights in the capital. It was still marred by a few holes, and the halberd flew into one of them, skewering his flesh. Jonathan tensed his muscles, and managed to stop the halberd from going in too deep, but the lightning surrounding it carried on, locking up his body. His skin melted, and the demon slowly got to its feet, grinning. The monster threw him off its halberd, tossing him high into the air. As he came down, the beast bent low, gathering up power in its halberd. As he neared the ground, the monster swung, sending the weapon on a blurring arc towards his head. Jonathan blocked it with his gauntlet, punching out to mitigate the force. Surprised by the strength in Jonathan's blow, the monster stumbled backwards, its halberd quivering from the impact. Jonathan ran forwards, and sent 3 punches into its stomach in the blink of an eye, lifting the monster off its feet. His eyes were slits of stony determination now, and he wailed on the monster, not letting it get an opening. The monster used its shockwave skill again, tossing Jonathan back, but Edgar filled the gap, sending another spear of wind into the monster's face. Jonathan got to his feet a moment later, and was upon the monster, slamming it viciously into the ground. The fact that he was dominating a being 4 feet taller than him was not lost on Jonathan, and he smiled weakly. He battered the monster into the ground, sending spurts of ichor every way as he did so. The monster tried to get up, but Jonathan was in the zone now, and he absolutely obliterated the monster's defenses with his superior stats. A few moments later, the creature was dead, and Jonathan gave it one more devastating punch for good measure, slamming its head into the stone with enough force to crack it open like a watermelon. Essence entered him, and he almost leveled up to level 83. He only had a small amount left. As his level approached that of the monsters, the speed at which he gained more was rapidly slowing down, and that demon kill had barely given him enough to rank up. Then again, he was sharing essence with Edgar, so that might have been some of the reason behind it. Jonathan sat down, resting for a moment as his beleaguered stamina pool replenished itself. Punching the monster into the ground had been tough, and it had been a decent enough fight. The demon probably had been in the upper echelons of the level range in the dungeon, and it had felt as if he was punching stone some of the time. However, his gauntlets were more than enough to break through, and the corpse on the ground showed just how strong he had become. By his earlier estimation, he was about halfway through Tier 1, in terms of necessary essence, and he hoped to be able to get to about level 85 by the end of the dungeon. The wave trial was coming up next, or, if he remembered correctly, perhaps it was something else. That trial had been marked as being a rare occurrence, which meant that there was likely a different test waiting for him in the next area. When Jonathan had recovered, he headed down to the tunnel, with Edgar following him. A few minutes later, as they neared the end of the passageway, they began to hear the sounds of fighting coming from below. Jonathan frowned. Perhaps it was the arena trial again. However, the noises were too loud, and they seemed to be far more than just a few fighters involved. It was almost as if there was a battle going on down there. They reached the end of the tunnel a few moments later, and leaped down into the cavern beyond. Hundreds of monsters battled one another on a large field, trying to break past the enemy lines to reach a tower that stood in the far corners of the cave. Each army was surrounded with a different color of light, with one colored blue and the other red. It seemed that to win, one group had to break the other one's tower. As they entered the cavern, Edgar and Jonathan were surrounded by a blue glow, leaving them with no doubt as to what they were supposed to do here. In order to beat this trial, they would need to support their monster allies in getting to the other side. Jonathan cracked his knuckles, and Edgar began to summon the wind to his hands, both men eager to get to work. A few seconds later, they were in the fray, pushing their way through the hordes of monsters. The ones marked with the same color of them were passive, and did not attack. They neared the front lines a few minutes later, having had to push their way through the ranks. The monsters were all humanoids, but a few of them were more exotic than the others, with a motley crew of random monster archetypes present here. Jonathan recognized a few goblins and more than a few demons. His fists crackled with power as he neared the enemies, and he broke through the final rank of his army, leaping into a war zone. Monsters fought and died all around him, their lifeblood painting the ground red, and a host of other colors besides. Jonathan got to work immediately, battering the monsters in front of him with his fists. They were surprisingly tough, but he was still stronger, and soon he had cleared out a space in the enemy army, allowing his allies to come in after him. Edgar launched a powerful wind-based attack into the ranks from the sidelines, causing explosions of razor-sharp guts to rip through the monsters. They rarely killed any of them, but they still injured the monsters readily enough. Jonathan was soon lost in a world of his own, tearing through the hordes of creatures in front of him with wild abandon. His battle trance skill came to the front, and he soon sank into its embrace, using it to guide his movements. Impact joined his roster a moment later, the damage that his skills did skyrocketing within the blink of an eye. On his own, he broke through dozens of monsters, quite literally in some cases, painting the ground behind him with blood. However, he soon lost himself in the enemy ranks, and was surrounded, his monstrous allies too weak to follow him. Jonathan only grinned. The monsters here seemed to be giving far less essence than they should have, given that they were more highly concentrated here than they were in any other part of the dungeon. However, he would gain a level by the end of this, when all was said and done. Jonathan channeled his mana and elemental energy into his hands, causing them to light up a moment later. With a grin, he leaped into the air above the nearby monsters' heads, and came down like a purple-tinged meteor, smashing skulls with his fists. The monsters around him were starting to thin, realizing that he was not a target worth wasting their strength on. Instead, they headed towards the enemy monster lines, as they had been doing originally. Jonathan slipped through their ranks like this, and killed dozens of monsters on the way, eventually reaching the back of the cave. The tower stood in front of him, a 30-foot-tall edifice of black rock. Jonathan launched himself at it, his hands burning with purple light. He started to slam his gauntlets into the stone, cracking it. As he did so, the monsters turned in unison, racing towards him as fast as their legs could carry them. His allies harried their back lines, but they ignored the assault, too fixated on Jonathan. Jonathan kept slamming his hands into the tower, and with one final strike, imbued with as much power as he could into his gauntlet, he broke through, shattering the tower with an explosion of light. The building had been much tougher than it had looked, which spoke volumes about his strength. Because of his lack of projectile skills in which he could dump a lot of mana, his destructive potential was limited, but he still carried a lot of strength within him. Behind him, the monster hordes froze, and started to crack apart into fragments of light that faded away into nothingness, leaving the cavern bare, save for Jonathan and Edgar. The two men gave each other a relieved glance as a small chest appeared on the far end of the cavern, where the entrance to the final section of the dungeon was. Jonathan, who was closer, headed over and opened the chest, revealing a suit of leather armor that was inlaid with metal. He quickly passed it over to Edgar, who was in dire need of some protection. His guard armor from the city had been too constricting and he had left it behind. Edgar scanned the armor and evidently was pleased, as his face lit up. He quickly donned the armor and walked up to the chest next to Jonathan, looking at the remainder of the items within it. There was a small wand in there that Edgar also picked up, which reminded Jonathan of the wand that he had stolen from that merchant back in the capital. "You should take this as well," Jonathan said, tossing Edgar the elemental focusing wand that had been in his storage device. Jonathan had largely forgotten about the weapon, having had bigger things on his mind. Edgar caught it deftly and gave the wand a spin, channeling his elemental energy through it. A lance of highly compressed wind shot out, fracturing a rock on the far end of the cavern. Edgar smiled and tucked the wand into his belt. There was one last item in the chest, a small vial filled with red liquid. Jonathan instantly recognized it as a healing potion, and he quickly stored it in his pouch, in order to protect it from being broken. With their new spoils, Jonathan decided that it was high time to check his stats, as well as those of Edgar. Neither man had seen one another's stat sheet, and it was time to change that. Jonathan had not checked on his stat sheet in quite some time, and he was looking forward to surveying his new gains. Without further ado, he popped open his stat sheet, to survey his new stats and skills. He extended it to Edgar as well, concealing the bits pertaining to his divinity in runes. He could exert great control over his stats sheet while showing it to others, in order to allay any privacy concerns. The system seemed to have thought of everything. Of course, to him, the relevant parts still showed up. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 1. Void Human, Advanced. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon. Elemental Mastery, 7%. Outsider, Tier 1. Level 82. 110 free points. Strength. 495. Dexterity. 398. Constitution. 297. Resilience. 355. Intelligence. 302. Wisdom. 302. Divinity. 5. Health 4455/4455. Stamina 7425/7425. Mana 4530/4530. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique. Nascent God, Transcendent. Lesser Xenocide, Legendary. Iron Will, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Giant Slayer, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Smite, Legendary. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Battle Focus, Rare. Impact, Rare. Mana Saber, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Apprentice 7. Runecrafting, Apprentice 3. Martial Arts, Apprentice 1. True Sight, Apprentice 1. Martial Path. Flowing Hurricane, Student 3. Quests. The Strongest. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Complete Vengeance, SSS. As Jonathan read the stat sheet, he was filled with a sense of profound accomplishment. He let out a small noise of astonishment, prompting Edgar to say something. "What is the matter?" Edgar asked, looking up from his new armor, which he had been peering at for a solid minute by now. Jonathan sighed. "Nothing. I just had a lot more stat points than I thought. It seems like not paying attention for so long has caused my abilities to skyrocket." Because of the gradual and intuitive nature of system-based stat games, he had steadily increased in power at a rate that did not make itself self-evident. Instead, it seemed natural, no matter how much strength he had. "I see. The presence of the system has started to have more of an impact on you as you gain strength. I was wondering if I was the only one. As I grow in power, approaching Tier 2, it feels as if this state was one that I have been in my entire life, as if I have always been this strong. I assume that is what ails you." "Well, take a look at my stat sheet, and see if I am right about that," Jonathan replied, noting that the other man had not yet accepted the invitation from Jonathan to do so. Edgar frowned, before tilting his head. "Are you sure? Such a gesture if one normally only extended to those you trust implicitly. Have I really reached that level in your mind? Oh. Is that some cultural thing from Telvaria? I was never really well versed in such matters. Still, we have fought and killed together. I believe that some trust is in order." Jonathan pushed the notification towards Edgar with his mind, causing it to pop up again, or at least that was what he imagined it doing. He had no way to access whatever it was that Edgar was seeing at the moment. "Very well. However, I will do the same for you. Here you are." Jonathan nodded, and a notification appeared a moment later. "Edgar Lackland has offered to share his status sheet with you. Accept? Y/N." Jonathan pressed yes, prompting a stat sheet to appear in front of him. It was very different from his own. Edgar Lackland. Tier 1. Human, Advanced. Elemental Mastery, 14%. Eolic Apprentice, Tier 1. Level 79. 24 free points. Strength. 106. Dexterity. 179. Constitution. 131. Resilience. 165. Intelligence. 374. Wisdom. 386. Health, 1965/1965. Stamina, 1590/1590. Mana, 5610/5610. Titles. Elemental Prodigy, Legendary. Wind's Disciple, Epic. Dispossessed, Rare. Superior Intellect, Rare. Expert Caster, Rare. Skills. Will of the Wind, Legendary. Levitate, Epic. Wind Channeling, Epic. Gust of Haste, Rare. Aeolic Shield, Rare. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Apprentice 5. Acrobatics, Student 8. Politician, Student 7. Mystical Path. Air Weaver, Apprentice 2. Quests. True Elemental Connection, SS. To reclaim a lost throne, Hesitant Face. The stat sheet was shorter than his own, Jonathan noticed almost immediately. However, Edgar seemed to be focused on one specific thing, which was his mastery of the wind. Jonathan idly began to flick through the skills, interested in what they said. He started at the lowest one first. Aeolic Shield, Rare. The wind is like a distant relation to you, and it is more than happy to shield you with its embrace. While not as durable as shields of other elements, it will still serve faithfully and reliably in battle. Gust of Haste, Rare. You may temporarily increase the speed of yourself and one ally with this skill, empowering them with the power of the wind. When under the effects of this skill, movement is increased at an amount proportional to the strength of the caster and the strength of the receiver. If cast on oneself, speed will be increased by a quarter over the norm. Wind channeling epic. The center of your path is that of the air, and you are able to manipulate the currents of the wind around you, creating spell constructs and attacks out of the fabric of the natural world. Using this skill will result in less power than individually tailored skills, but will grant far more versatility. You can improve the power and stability of these constructs with your mana and elemental energy. Levitate epic. The pull of gravity holds limited power over one of your affinity for the wind, and you may escape its hold for a limited period, allowing you to approximate flight. This flight is highly taxing on your mana reserves however, and you must pay close attention to your expectations, versus the reality of your power. Will of the Wind legendary. In connecting with the conceptual nature of your element, you have discovered the true essence of the air, that of freedom. On a highly limited scale, you may imbue your techniques with this concept, allowing you to lower the weight of objects that you, or your skill, come in contact with. The pathway. Skills were self-evident, and Jonathan felt no need to investigate them. Edgar had few skills, but all of them seemed to fit his needs perfectly, and there was a very clear line of progression evident within his skills, starting from the lowest one. There were no extraneous skills, save for politician, which likely had something to do with his past. His skills were about on the same level as Jonathan's, which was surprising, given how much longer Edgar had to hone them. However, that likely had something to do with the lack of available training resources in Telvaria. The Hells were far more conducive to growth. In addition, his stats were low, but not that low, and his mental ones were actually higher than Jonathan's. Jonathan closed the stat sheet to see Edgar peering at the air in front of himself with disbelief. Siren's Lance. What in the name of the gods is this? How are you so powerful at this level? Edgar asked, almost unable to believe his eyes at the sheer power of Jonathan's stats. His stats probably looked far more suspicious than they would be normally, given that he had hidden all mention of anything to do with his divinity or runes, which meant that his main strength-boosting title was absent. Jonathan shrugged at his companion, not wanting to explain the real reason behind the incredible strength that he exhibited. This seemed to assuage Edgar's curiosity, and he managed to steer the other man's mind away from that topic. With no further words exchanged, they continued down the tunnel, heading for the final challenge of this dungeon. The dungeon boss. It was likely to be a Medusa like it had been before, given that the overall layout of the dungeon had not been changed, just some of the minor details. In any case, this fight would be a lot easier with two fighters, both of whom had the enhanced senses granted by their races. Soon they were upon the entrance to the cavern that contained the monster, and they slowed down, keeping an eye out for the creature. It would not be good for one of them to fall prey to its eyes this early in the fight. Thankfully, the monster was otherwise engaged within its cabin, no doubt poring over whatever noxious food it enjoyed. Jonathan knew that whatever it ate, it did so not for sustenance, but for strength, given that people at this level did not need any food to survive, or if they did, it was too little to be noticeable at the rate that Jonathan was leveling. The monster drew out power from the prey that it consumed, or at least it seemed that way given what the last Medusa had said. In any case, it hardly mattered to Jonathan's present concerns. It was a monster that needed to be killed, and no more. The two men snuck into the cavern, edging around the sides of the hut a few minutes later, having traversed the rows of disturbingly lifelike statues around the hut, the remnants of the Medusa's previous prey. Jonathan knew that it was all for show, given that the dungeon was instanced, but the system liked to add in a bit of flavor to its dungeons, given the fact that the Medusa last time around had believed that it had actually fought other adventurers before. Perhaps it had, and the monster was actually being recycled through the different dungeon layouts, which would have been interesting to say the least. However, it was still their enemy. It was time to strike, and there could be no mercy afforded to such a dangerous foe. The two men closed their eyes in preparation, and approached the hut, getting ready to strike. The Medusa was still inside, bent over a table in the center of the hut. A moment later, Jonathan kicked the door in, prompting the monster within to let out a hiss of rage. Jonathan sensed the creature turn their way, and paused as it realized that its petrifying gaze did not affect them. Rather than banter like the last Medusa had, this one flashed forwards at high speeds, leveraging its advanced level to attack. It was not simply a one-trick monster, but a powerful being in its own right, with the petrification ability tacked on. It was almost as fast as Jonathan, and he only got out of the way with a bare instant to spare. Jonathan lashed out with his void-coated fist, slamming it into the side of the monster, eliciting another hiss. The creature stumbled, straight into a gust of wind from Edgar that flayed its flesh from its bones. However, the damage was minimal, and Jonathan raced in, trying to get another strike. His senses had become unbelievably sharp, even more potent than they had been the first time he had completed this dungeon, and he was able to almost see a full picture of the world around him in his mind, allowing him to parry an incoming strike. The taloned hand of the Medusa skittered off his gauntlet, and Jonathan grabbed onto the limb, pulling it up and over his head. The monster resisted, but Jonathan overpowered it, and slammed the creature into the ground, adding in his redirect skill for good measure. Bones cracked, and a crater exploded into being beneath the monster, showcasing the sort of power that Jonathan was putting out with his near 500 strength. The monster writhed free from his grasp and sent its hand on a collision course for one of the holes in his armor. Jonathan ducked, and weaved backwards, avoiding the attack with inches to spare. The Medusa got to its feet, and changed targets, heading for Edgar, who was weaving together a potent attack in the background. As the Medusa approached the mage, the man released the strike, creating a giant spear of wind, ensconced within a tunnel of pure compressed air that accelerated it at supersonic speeds. There was a boom, and then the spear broke through the monster's chest, and out the other side. The damage was significant, but not fatal, and the Medusa plowed through the attack, ripping into Edgar a moment later. The man was sent flying backwards, and he smashed into one of the nearby statues, shattering it. With his lower durability than Jonathan, Edgar had taken quite a bit of damage from that strike, and the Medusa was closing in, eager to inflict more. A moment later his fist detonated, sending a shockwave of light that blasted apart the Medusa's guard and nailed it directly in the chest. As the monster staggered backwards, with a gaping wound visible on its torso, Jonathan landed, and balled his fist, driving it into the creature's abdomen. There was a whoosh of expelled air, and the creature was lifted off its feet, smashing into a statue, much in the same way as Edgar had a few moments ago. The Wind Mage was in the process of getting to his feet, but one of his arms was broken, and if Jonathan had his eyes open, he would have been able to see the pain on the man's face. However, Edgar had suffered worse, and he cast his support spell on Jonathan, improving his movement speed. Jonathan tore across the ground, cracking the stone beneath his feet, but the Medusa was ready with its final attack. The creature swelled with muscles, and rose to its feet, grinning. Jonathan rolled to the side, and the creature sent a devastating axe kick towards the space where he had been, breaking the stone with ease. In its current state, the Medusa was stronger than Jonathan was, and he remembered the other skill that the last one had exhibited. As an imperceptible amount of brightness entered his eyes, his instinct took over and he covered his face, just as the monster released a shockwave of blinding light. Last time it had seared his eyelids off, but this time he was prepared. He heard a curse come from Edgar's direction, and he grimaced, realizing that the other man had not been as fortunate. He had likely been distracted by his injuries, and although Jonathan had warned him about this ability, it came quite fast, probably too fast for Edgar to prepare for with his lower dexterity. Jonathan removed his hands, and then moved in, sending a quick series of blows into the monster. He could not use his impact skill with his eyes closed, so he was missing out on a bit of damage, but it hardly mattered. The Medusa took the strikes in stride, and then counterattacked, slamming its meaty fist into his head. Jonathan staggered, straight into a kick that sent him flying up into the air. He flipped, and brought his fist back, pinpointing the position of the Medusa with his senses. Jonathan slammed his fist down into his foe, staggering it. The Medusa recovered quickly, and tried to punch Jonathan, but he twisted in midair to avoid the highly telegraphed attack. The monster snarled and tried to use its shockwave ability again, but this time Jonathan was ready and he drove both fists into the monster, sending it backwards, and aborting the attack. The Medusa skidded to a halt a few dozen feet away, and regarded Jonathan with a baleful gaze. Behind him, Edgar seemed to be recovering somewhat, as he had not been the target of the Medusa's gaze while his eyes had been vulnerable. "You are not of the normal ilk of adventurers who come in here. What are you?" the monster asked, in a calm voice. "I could ask the same of you. Why do you talk about other adventurers? Do you not know that this dungeon is but a construct of the system?" Jonathan asked, interested in what this would cause the Medusa to do. Would he trigger some sort of existential crisis within the monster, or would it just ignore him? "Lies. The primal god warned me of the things that your kind would say, in order to send me away from my purpose. I will not listen to them. Now, this farce has gone on long enough. Die." Before Jonathan could wonder what exactly the primal god was, the Medusa tore across the ground, cracking the earth with each lumbering step. Edgar sent in a spear of wind, imbued with his new ability, and the Medusa levitated for a second, causing it to stumble. Jonathan raced forwards, and began to pummel the monster with devastating blows of his gauntlets. However, the creature gave as good as it got, and eventually one lucky strike broke through the hole in its armor, and slammed into his chest, breaking his ribs. Jonathan let out a sharp breath as the pain hit him, but he ignored it for the most part. If all went well here, he would merely heal afterwards. The Medusa was in ruins by now, but it still held strong, and seemed to be mostly unaffected by the litany of wounds that spread across its kin. However, Jonathan could not say the same. His stamina was gradually being worn down from having to fight such a powerful opponent, and even with his utterly massive pool, it was lowering by the second. His health bar was taking a hit as well, with each devastating blow from the Medusa shaving off more and more of its length. The creature was almost at tier 2, and its battle prowess and power certainly matched that lofty height of power. Jonathan was slowly being pushed back, but he knew that his final skill would allow him to make a difference. Smite would level the odds, but before he tried it out, he had one last ability that he needed to hone before using it in further battle. Jonathan leaped backwards, clearing a space for a moment, and then summoned the pure conceptual power of the void to his right hand, creating a pocket of empty space in front of it. The Medusa seemed none the wiser, and it came in like a wrecking ball, driving one fist into Jonathan's left shoulder. Something popped in the joint, but Jonathan ignored it, sending his fist in a devastating uppercut. The attack struck the base of the monster's jaw, and before it could react, there was a sharp implosion as the entire bottom half of its head simply vanished. Despite its small radius of effect, the skill was still monumentally powerful, as befitted its status as a mythical skill. However, using it to such an extent taxed Jonathan's ability to draw upon the power of his element, and he was forced to dispel the effect, sending a normal punch into the hole that his last one had left. There was a dull squelch, and the monster gurgled faintly as his fist drove up into its brain, killing it. Essence entered him in a tide, and he opened his eyes, watching the monster's corpse fall off his hand before disappearing. He remembered what was to come next, however, and he dashed back towards Edgar, in order to prepare the man for the doppelgangers that would come for them next. Edgar had healed over from his share of the essence, but he still looked utterly exhausted, and the man was clearly not ready for what was to come. Before Jonathan could reach him, two figures appeared in the center of the cavern, both of whom were mirror images of Jonathan and Edgar. Edgar's clone ran towards him, and Jonathan's approached him, its face unreadable under its helmet. Jonathan readied his fist, and then punched towards his foe, sending a straight right, imbued with the power of the void, into his clone's face. The monster ducked, and then sent a return strike towards Jonathan's stomach. Jonathan twisted out of the way, and summoned the void to his foot, kicking his enemy in the right leg. Last time it had been unable to use this element, and it seemed as if the theme would continue here. There was a dull crack as the bone was bent out of its socket, and the clone snarled. It used the momentum to drive one of its fists, burning with the power of condensed mana, towards Jonathan. Jonathan parried the blow with his left hand, sending another punch into the monster's face. It was torn off its feet, and the monster tumbled head over heels before regaining its balance. Jonathan surged forwards, running after it at near sonic speeds. It was strange that he was not already there, given the amount of stat points that he had in dexterity, but it was probably some physics-related problem, to do with how hard it was to accelerate a body to that high of a speed. The air resistance alone would cut off a lot of his potential momentum. His hands were capable of reaching that speed, but they were too small to make much of a noise, given that the sound of his punches normally were louder than the resulting sonic boom. However, it was still impressive to say the least. Jonathan engaged his doppelganger in a blurring display of skill and speed, parrying, punching and blocking in equal measure. He had increased a lot in his martial skill since he had fought this dungeon last, and the difference was nothing short of astounding, especially with his new speed. His punches stirred up the air around them, and his kicks sent shockwaves through the air as they landed on the armor of his counterpart. However, his clone was holding his own, which was to Jonathan's benefit, as he was using this as a training opportunity. His elemental abilities were too strong to be denied if he used it, but there was no better opponent to hone one's skills than themselves. Jonathan had used quite a few battles in the past to hone his skills, and this one would be no different. As he felt his own attacks and techniques coming back at him, and how they integrated with another, he was able to refine his moves and attacks, in order to become better than himself. Over the new few minutes, he eventually started to overpower his doppelganger with sheer skill, doing something that should have been impossible. He was beating himself in a fair fight. His punches started to land with greater frequency, and soon the doppelganger was on the back foot, being pushed into the wall. Jonathan sped up even more, weaving his punches around the hasty blocks and parries of his opponent, with most of them striking home. He underwent a sort of minor apotheosis within that moment, and he knew exactly what his clone was going to do in the next moment. After all, it was himself. As if in a trance, Jonathan mastered his own body for one brief moment, and simply responded. His fist soared through the air at the exact right angle to cross right between the incoming punches of his enemy, and straight into its face. Such was the skill imbued within that punch that it cracked the helmet of his clone, and shattered its skull, killing the creature in an instant. Jonathan withdrew his fist, sensing that there was a notification waiting for him. You have reached student rank 7 with flowing hurricane. There was another notification waiting underneath that one as well, and seeing as Edgar was still fighting his clone, Jonathan decided to open it. After all, it seemed as if Edgar had this in hand, and he would likely see it as an insult for Jonathan to try and help him. You have gained a new title. Mastery of the Self, Legendary. You have defeated yourself in a pure contest of skill, showing that you can adapt to new environments faster than the you of a few minutes ago. In doing this, you have demonstrated the ability to learn at impressive rates, at least in the sphere of martial abilities. Plus 25% to all martial skill advancement. There were no stat bonuses, but the actual reward was quite good. It would allow for Jonathan to hone his skills far faster than before, and he would let him increase the rank of his martial arts and fighting style skills greatly. He looked over at Edgar, who was still engaged in a magical display of power, locked in a wizard's duel with his doppelganger. The two fighters were throwing bolts of wind and other such attacks at one another, seeming to be fighting until one of them ran out of mana. Both men dodged and weaved around the attacks, and sometimes summoned shields of air around themselves. Edgar looked haggard, but he was slowly gaining an edge on his clone, which was good. Jonathan would step in, courtesy be damned, if his friend was losing, but as that did not seem to be the case, he was fine with watching. The only way he was able to tell the two apart was by scanning them, as one of them simply came up as a monster of the doppelganger species, while the other was actually Edgar. The man seemed to be honing his magical abilities in the fight, and his elemental techniques were increasing gradually in size and power as he fought, seeming to be responding well to facing himself. His doppelganger was able to use the power of the air for some reason, while as Jonathan's had not been able to fight with the void, but perhaps the void was too powerful for a doppelganger to channel, while as one of the more basic elements was not. A few minutes later the battle came to a close, with Edgar thrusting a spear of wind through the head of his opponent, killing it once and for all. With a light whoosh, the world around them warped, depositing them within a small room. It was not the same as the reward vault that Jonathan had been transported to when he had cleared the dungeon for the first time, likely because this time he had fought with a companion. The first time around, he had been promised extra rewards on account of his solo delve, but this time there was no reason to do so. As a result, the stacks of weapons, armor and other items were far smaller than before, and they seemed to be tailored specifically towards Edgar's talents, as the dungeon seemed to recognize that Jonathan had cleared it before. A notification appeared, and Jonathan opened it. For completing the dungeon in a group of 2, each of you may choose either one piece of armor, or one weapon. Jonathan closed the notification, and started to look around, seeing what the best option was. He doubted that the system would allow for Edgar to simply pick 2 objects, as would be more efficient, so Jonathan would have to think. There were about a dozen suits of armor in the place, all of which seemed to be light variants of armor, either made out of chainmail or leather. None of them suited Jonathan, so he moved on, letting Edgar look over the armor. They would deliberate on the best choices after they had both seen the extent of the options available. Jonathan walked through the weapons, finding a few more options, but none of which were good enough for him. Again, they seemed to be tailor-made for Edgar, and all of them were some variant of staff or wand, or other elemental focus, something that would break if used as a bludgeoning implement. However, Jonathan would still have to pick something. There were no miscellaneous items this time, which made his job easier, and he eventually doubled back, meeting Edgar in the middle of the weapon aisle. "Any idea what you want? None of this stuff really suits me. I can pick one for you to use however. To be perfectly honest, this is a hard choice to make. I already have some good gear from before, but I did notice that these pieces have the option to upgrade to tier 2, which makes them more valuable in the long run. If I had to make a decision though, I would go for the Sunrise Mage armor set, and the Wand of Gusts. Both of them are suitable for my magic, and they provide great options in battle." Jonathan nodded, wondering why Edgar had gotten items with such poetic names, while had been stuck with things that were far more utilitarian, but he didn't really care. He watched Edgar walk towards the wand, which meant that he was supposed to claim the armor. Jonathan sidled back into the armor aisle, and began to scan suits of armor, eventually finding his target, a set of chainmail armor that seemed to glisten in the light of the cavern, giving off an auburn hue. He quickly read over the armor stats before claiming it. Sunrise Mage Armor. Tier 1 Growth Armor, Light. Armor crafted after the pattern of the legendary mage Alvaran of the Dawn, this suit increases the power of all magical abilities, as well as giving serviceable defenses to the wearer. However, it is not intended for prolonged melee combat, and is subsequently quite fragile. The lingering conceptual presence of the man who inspired it lurks within this armor, and all true followers of the magical path will be able to access its innermost secrets. Growth Reagents, Tier 2 Bone, Tier 2 Blood, Tier 2 Dawnstone. +7 to Intelligence, +7 to Wisdom while wearing. As Jonathan picked up the suit of armor, the cavern started to shake, and a moment later both men were deposited outside the entrance of the dungeon. Only this time, Jonathan hoped that there was not an army waiting for them. Of course, in no universe would Jonathan ever be so lucky as to get what he wanted, even once. As the 2 men climbed over the rock face that separated the dungeon from the rest of the world, they beheld a vast array of soldiers waiting in perfectly formed ranks. Waiting for them. Jonathan and Edgar tensed up as they saw this, and Jonathan tried to get a quick head count of the legion waiting for them. In the short amount of time that he had, he was unable to do so. There were easily thousands of soldiers waiting for them, and even a few tier 2s headed the armies. This could easily spell their end. Jonathan snarled, and Edgar frowned beside him, the 2 men searching for a way to get out of this. A few flying ships hovered in the background, which would render Edgar's flight mostly useless, as they would simply be sniped out of the air. This time, the forces of Granath had learned from their mistakes in facing Jonathan before, and there were entire contingents of mages and artillery pieces, ready to launch their deadly payloads at the two men. Jonathan spotted more than a few of the catapults loaded with the same glassy orbs that had taken him out last time, with their toxic payloads of noxious gas. Without another word, Jonathan started running, and leaped off the side of the cliff. This would end in bloodshed one way or another, and there was no reason not to start now. Edgar floated down behind him, a few seconds slower, already charging up a powerful attack in his hands, the air in the area being sucked towards him in a hurricane-like wave of power. Jonathan landed a moment later, bending his knees slightly, and started to send his mana and divinity to his hands, empowering them to new heights. As the implacable army stared back at him across the plain, Jonathan roared out loud, and charged, flashing across the ground. Jonathan led the way with his fists, tearing through the ranks of the relatively low-level soldiers. Most of them were around level 60, which, while impressive, was nothing compared to Jonathan. He did not linger for more than a second in any one place, tearing through the enemy lines like a thunderbolt. They tightened around him, trying to slow him down with their bodies, but he easily broke free, shattering bones and armor with his sheer speed and power. All around him, the mages began to cast their deadly spells, sending all manner of elemental fury down upon him. Bolts of lightning leaped down from the cloudless sky as if the divine wrath of some god above was being visited on Jonathan. However, this only made him smile. He was the only real god here. As if to back up this sentiment, golden arcs of divinity coursed down his arms, and into the runes on his gauntlets, filling them with the conceptual power of their nature. The left gauntlet distracted the nearby soldiers with its alluring glow, whereas the right one punished them for their distraction, slamming down with a nova of reddish energy surrounding it. The soldiers fell like chaff before Jonathan, as not only was he stronger than them, he outleveled them, a first in his time in this world. Before he had been the underdog. Now he was the predator. However, these were only the foot soldiers, and the leaders of this army were far more imposing. Now that he had progressed in power so much, Granath was able to send far more powerful opponents after him, ones that would easily be able to kill him if he was not careful. Blasts of elemental energy and light heralded his path through the army, and he could sense a few monolithic energy signatures coming his way with his more metaphysical senses, telling him of the arrival of a few of those aforementioned powerful enemies charging his way. A few seconds later, a hulking brute of a fighter smashed through the lines of soldiers in front of him, paying no heed to the plight of his own men. The figure bellowed out loud, activating a powerful ability that seemed to inflict a sense of dread on Jonathan, one that he cleared quickly enough with his divinity, and then charged, hefting a massive batlaxe over his head. The weapon glowed with light and then came down like a thunderbolt, moving far faster than a weapon of that size had any right to. Jonathan dodged, knowing that he would be unable to parry it, and the weapon landed next to him, sending a tremor through the ground that knocked the weaker fighters off their feet. Jonathan felt a warm gust of wind strike his back, filling him with a sense of speed. It seemed that Edgar was aware of what was going on around him. Jonathan smiled and flashed forwards, surprising his enemy with his power. The nearby soldiers backed away, knowing that they would do no good in a conflict of this level. Instead, they started to clear a space for Jonathan, and in response, the hulking brute that he was facing seemed to perk up. "I was warned about you, Jonathan Harlow, but you certainly don't seem to be worth all the hubbub. I was expecting you to be taller." This nonsensical declaration, in a world where size mattered little, if not at all, caused Jonathan to laugh. Rather than back this up with a reasoning, Jonathan simply charged, using the short lull in the combat as an opening. The other fighter bellowed again, and swiped his axe around, trying to catch Jonathan. Jonathan leaped over the silvery arc of metal, its incredibly fast movement looking like nothing more than the swipe of a languid hand to him. He landed within the other man's guard and punched, denting the metal of the man's breastplate with his fist. A wave of energy shot out of his hand, the secondary part of the punch, and carried on through the armor and into its wearer. The man stumbled backwards, coughing up blood, and then seemed to take a moment to steady himself. However, this was an illusion, and he used the movement to send his axe haft on a swiftly curving trajectory for Jonathan's face. At this range there was no dodging an attack of that speed, and Jonathan was forced to roll with the attack, feeling teeth shatter as it landed. He might have been faster than this man, but the other fighter was still a tier 2, and possessed an untold number of hidden advantages, not least of which was his monstrous strength. A few seconds later, Jonathan felt a searing beam of heat racing through the air towards him, and he dodged just in time to see a small lance of light shoot past his head and into the massed fighters around him. A woman dressed in silken robes leaped over the heads of the waiting army, and landed in the middle of the circle. She was undoubtedly another tier 2, and the source of the beam that had almost taken his head off. Even now, the attack detonated a few dozen feet away, sending up a pillar of flame into the air rather than exploding, a pillar of flame that instantly fused the ash into glass. Jonathan ignored this, taking in the appearance of the newcomer. The woman possessed an austere sort of beauty, with a carefully coiffed head of hair and a face that looked to be expertly cared for, in order to preserve as much of her charms as possible, even within a battle. The woman snorted at Jonathan, dispelling the image moment later. "This pissant was giving you so much trouble," she said to the other fighter. "I doubt he would even dodge one of my more powerful abilities." "Oh, shut up, Rowena. You might think you're better than the rest of us, what with your Crimson Sect training, but all you are is another flighty mage. When the fighting gets tough, your kind simply runs. At least we survive, unlike you meatheads," the woman replied, seemingly unconcerned of Jonathan's presence. Something clearly linked the two fighters, but Jonathan didn't have time to engage in such idle curiosities, and he moved, heading towards the army around him. He did not want to fight these two if he could help it, and his primary objective was meeting up with Edgar once more and getting the hell out of here. It seemed that most of the heavy hitters in this army had been sent after him rather than his companion, which was just as well. Jonathan could hear Edgar at work, sending highly concentrated blasts of wind toward his enemies. However, the other man was not a major focus of the army, as most of the weaker fighters were mobbing him instead of coming after Jonathan. "Hey! I'm not finished with you, you cowardly piece of garbage!" the female mage called after him. A moment later an arrow of lightning burst out from her fingertips, sent towards Jonathan's back. He snarled. This woman was starting to rub him the wrong way. A dome of questing void light shot out of his hands, heading for the spell, and hungrily devoured it midair, tearing apart its man and elemental energy. Jonathan kept running, smiling at the screams of indignant outrage from behind him. "What was that you were saying?" He could faintly hear the armored fighter gloat to his companion, as he started running after Jonathan. Jonathan legged it through the grasping hordes of enemy soldiers, feeling them break upon him as he rushed through. If nothing else, they were very disciplined, in the face of a far stronger fighter. Every now and again some sort of captain figure would step out of the woodwork and manage to land a hit on Jonathan, but other than that it was smooth sailing. He was ridiculously powerful, at least compared to these fighters, and as a result their presence was almost negligible. In addition, the various siege engines that the army possessed were unable to target him because of his position, leaving it up to the two bickering tier 2s to find him. He could hear the brutish one of the pair barging through the ranks behind him, treading over the mashed heaps of flesh and armor that Jonathan had left in his wake. Although disgusting, it was good for essence gain, and he could feel himself creeping up towards another level. In addition, he did not feel any pity for these people, as they had tried to kill him and Edgar, as well as being the servants of the true engineer of his troubles within this realm. No, they did not deserve his pity. Jonathan eventually spotted Edgar through a small gap in the massed hordes, and charged towards him, blasting out a moment later in front of the man. Edgar looked harangued, and he was covered in wounds. However, he was surrounded by a bulwark of corpses, propped up by their own weight. Jonathan snatched up Edgar, taking the weaker man on his back and raced towards the end of the army, trying to stay ahead of the pursuing tier 2s. Edgar took this all in stride, and used Jonathan as a mobile turret, blasting any nearby enemy with his wind-based powers. They were in no need to stay here and fight, and they needed to escape sooner rather than later. No gains that they could make here would be worth getting captured again. In any case, they were probably under orders to just kill Edgar, as Jonathan was the only one who Granath needed alive in any case. He had both the book and the means to read it, which meant that Granath would be interested indeed with his well-being. It was perhaps the only reason why the Tier 2s were not going all out. They had idly chattered while Jonathan had been in their sight, which meant that he was likely little to no threat to them, at least with what they knew about him. If he was forced to actually fight them, however, they would find that assumption to be lacking in its veracity. In any case, he had no intention of doing that, so his slightly bruised ego would just have to put up with it for now. He could hear them even now, still talking to one another as they plowed through the slowly moving ranks of their own army. The presence of the main bulk of the fighters was merely a distraction away from the main forces sent to capture Jonathan, namely the Tier 2s, and the flying galleons. All they really did was slow him down as he tried to make his way through them, allowing his more powerful pursuers to keep up. However, Edgar was doing an admirable job keeping the path clear, creating plows of wind that scooped soldiers out of the way. This made a path for them through the throngs of slowly moving fighters standing in their way, allowing them to head for the back of the army. Unlike last time Jonathan had stood against a full army, he was far faster than his enemies now, and it was like watching them in slow motion as he sped past them. Their troop movements were quick and efficient, at least by the standard of their level, but to Jonathan they were abysmally slow. He only entered this state of true speed when he was really into a battle, and his stats were unleashed to the fullest. Otherwise he would have trouble speaking to people of a lower level than himself, even Edgar. It was more of a subconscious thing than anything else, likely some imprint of the system, but Jonathan was still grateful for it nonetheless. As the two men broke through the final ranks a few minutes later, they were met by the intimating visages of 100 siege engines, all pointed their way. Jonathan barely had a moment to raise his arms, and Edgar to summon a shield, before the weapons were all loosed their way. A myriad of various projectiles hissed through the air, moving at incredible speeds. None of them worried him overmuch, save for the dozens of glass orbs that contained the same poison that had led to his capture in the first place. As they broke around him, Jonathan sighed in relief as Edgar's swirling aegis of wind carried off the gases, sending them into the troops behind. A wave of collapsing soldiers spread across the plain as the gas was dispersed, and Jonathan smiled beneath his helmet. That had gone far better than he had expected. However, it was not to last. The air in front of the two men cracked open, leaving behind a silvery blue portal that stretched off into infinity. The effect was similar to how it looked if one set up two mirrors facing one another, and looked into them. A moment later, the portal rippled and two figures stepped out, the same Tier 2s, who had been after Jonathan earlier. The same bored expressions were still on their faces as before, and the woman yawned openly upon seeing Jonathan. "I must say, making us personally involve ourselves is impressive for your level. However, you are still ants before us," the woman said, her voice getting on Jonathan's nerves. He had no idea if it was some supernatural effect, or if the woman was just that annoying. "Are you really the best that bloated worm can send after us? Is he still cowering in his keep, in utter terror of our might?" Edgar said harshly, his voice changing dramatically. Jonathan concealed a smirk. That was likely the effect of the man's politician skill. "You dare," the woman spluttered in utter disbelief. A wreath of lightning snapped to her fingers and she began to raise them towards the two men, her face twisting in rage. Beside her, the hulking brute of a melee fighter started to run his hand down the length of his weapon, imbuing it with power. A moment later, the battle was on. A crackling net of lightning shot out of the woman's hands, spreading across the air. Edgar immediately got to work trying to head it off, using both his elemental energy and his mana to do so. As he did not have any dedicated unbinding spell, it was hard going, but he still managed to shield himself from the effects for long enough that Jonathan was able to get around the field of energy. It was a comical sight, seeing a man riding another man through the battlefield like a horse, but it was a surprisingly powerful combination. Jonathan was too fast to be taken unawares by such a trick, however, and he drove his fist into his enemy's gut, causing the other man to curse. Jonathan pushed back and sent his other fist surging in on the heels of the first one, rocking back the armored man in front of him. Behind him, Edgar was trying desperately to fend off the attention of the female mage, who was laughing out loud as her spells pushed Edgar further and further back. As one especially devastating spell was launched at Jonathan's companion, he snapped his fingers, sending a dart of void mana towards the spell, unbinding it. However, this rendered him vulnerable, and his opponent drove one fist into his chin, knocking him off his feet. As he flew up into the air, the man pulled back his weapon and then swung mightily towards Jonathan, slamming the thing into his stomach. Jonathan was bent double over the blade and was flung off its end, to crash into one of the siege engines parked nearby. As if planned, the weapon loosed its payload, sending a tree trunk-like bolt towards Jonathan. He batted it aside with one hand, feeling his wrist twinge as he did so, and slammed into the weapon with a flying punch, taking it out of commission in an explosion of splinters. Behind him the Tier 2 man charged, catching up to him in an instant, his form limned with the light of some sort of movement skill. Jonathan turned just in time to catch the man's strike with his gauntlets, stopping it from cleaving him in two. Metal screeched off of metal, and Jonathan hurriedly reinforced the gauntlets with energy, causing them to glow with power. The Tier 2 grunted, and forced the weapon down, leveraging his superior strength to crush Jonathan into the ash with his strength. However, the substance was quite yielding, and instead of compressing Jonathan's bones, the man merely caused him to sink into the ash. Jonathan sent mana down through his feet, an easy feat with his mastery over mana manipulation, at least for his level, and pushed back, managing to surprise his opponent with the sudden burst of energy. With a roar, he slammed his right fist into the weapon, moving too quickly for the other man to take advantage of. With a creaking groan, the man slipped, sending his weapon into the ash. Jonathan leaped out of the hole in an instant, and sent a barrage of powerful punches towards the other man, rocking him back on his feet. Small dents formed on the armor, and Jonathan heard his enemy grunt in pain. He risked a glance towards Edgar, and found that the man was faring far worse. The battle was less of a one-sided beatdown than he had been expecting, but Edgar was still being dealt with handily, his wind abilities and the resulting speed the only reason he was still standing. His battle was a far more evasive one than Jonathan, and he was fighting for his life. In comparison, Jonathan was confident that he would be able to beat this man, and perhaps the woman as well, if he went all out. In preparation for this, Jonathan drew upon his conceptual mastery over the void, straining his mind to eke out as much of the power as he possibly could. His fist briefly blazed with purple light, and then turned a far more dangerous color. None at all. His opponent barked out a laugh at this seeming lack of control on Jonathan's part, which was swiftly met with a devastating uppercut from Jonathan's fist. He drove up with all of his power in a blurring arc, starting near his toes and soaring up above his head. Metal groaned, and Jonathan lifted his enemy off his feet, tossing him high into the air. A droplet of blood fell from the sky, landing on one of his gauntlets. The weapon unexpectedly flared with light, and he remembered the upgrade requirements for the weapon. It required Tier 2 blood, Tier 2 bone, and dark iron. Of those three, he could find two right here and now if he played his cards right. It seemed that his gauntlet simply absorbed the upgrade material, and he remembered that his armor also could be upgraded the same way. He smiled as he imagined the sheer brutality that fusing one's armaments with the flesh and bone of one's enemies entailed. Good. They deserved it. Jonathan was unable to get out of the way in time, and he instead punched straight up, knowing that this impact was going to hurt. Mana and elemental energy flooded to his fist, along with his divinity. His fist exploded into a ball of light as he punched, meeting his enemy's strike head-on. There was a brief moment of silence and stillness as their strikes met, and then the world seemed to crack apart as an explosion ripped through the air, tossing Jonathan head over heels. His bones shattered, and his muscles tore as he flew. He could only hope that his foe was suffering a similar fate. His body blossomed into golden light as he channeled his divinity into his flesh and blood, causing him to glow like a beacon of godly power. His broken bones faded to insignificance in front of the supreme power coursing within him, and Jonathan roared, expelling a gust of golden energy that washed over the ground in front of him. With a tense of his legs, Jonathan took off, speeding towards the site of the explosion that had injured him. As he reached his top speed, he finally did it. A sonic boom echoed across the land as he broke the sound barrier, and he let out a primal scream of joy, spotting the body of his enemy in the process. The Tier 2 man did not look all the worse for wear, and he seemed to be recovering rather rapidly. Jonathan sped up slightly as he ran, realizing that he needed to get there in time before Smite wore off. It was a powerful skill, but one with very clear limits that would render him helpless if broken. Jonathan skidded to a halt in front of the Tier 2 fighter, using his momentum to build up a powerful punch. His fist carried all of his energy forward, and just as the Tier 2 got to his feet, brandishing his weapon, Jonathan's hand came forwards like a wrecking ball, slamming into his face. There was a bang, and the man was tossed off his feet, a small gust of reddish light taking him away, the remnants of Jonathan's divinity contained within his rune. Before the other man could recover, Jonathan flashed towards the woman, who looked to be whipping Edgar with a semi-corporeal strand of light, laughing at him as she did so. Jonathan howled in anger, heralding his presence to the woman. She looked up, sneering, but as she realized his true speed, her face fell. Before the woman could muster any sort of defense, Jonathan was upon her. A half-formed shield was already in the air around her, but his fist broke it effortlessly, and as energy blossomed around it, the woman let out a short cry of alarm. When his fist hit, it was utterly devastating, and the woman seemed to break around his hand, her bones snapping like an endless line of firecrackers. She was almost blasted in two by the power of his strike, but as he withdrew his hand, energy rushed into her from the world around her, and her wounds started to heal over. With blood bubbling up over her lips, she started to cast a spell. Jonathan slammed his hand into her once more, but she was now surrounded by a powerful shield that rebuffed his attack, causing it to skitter off of it. She grimaced and then thrust her palm forwards, expelling a lance of silvery energy that carried Jonathan up into the air. He felt the lance begin to drill into his armor, and he hurriedly slapped a hand down to it, causing the spell to be consumed by his void energy. Behind him, he heard a bestial roar as the Tier 2 melee fighter got back up, out for his blood. All around them, the soldiers were watching as if in a trance, knowing that there was nothing that they could do against the almost godlike fighters that were duking it out before them. Jonathan almost felt sorry for them, before he remembered whose side he was on. As he came back down to the ground, he saw that his divinity stores were starting to give out, and neither of his opponents were near death yet. The man was severely injured from the explosion caused by the mingling of their techniques, but he was still able to stand, and likely possessed hidden wells of power. No, this was not a battle that Jonathan would be able to easily win. He made a snap decision, and picked up Edgar, who was covered in blood, and started running for it, heading away from the battlefield. Edgar was semi-conscious at this point, and he only groaned slightly in response to the motion, causing Jonathan to worry about the state of his companion's health. He didn't seem to have any broken bones or severe injuries, but he was still bleeding heavily from a score of wounds on his back and face that seemed to have been inflicted for the purpose of maximum pain. Jonathan clenched one fist as he ran, using the other to stabilize Edgar. He would come back for the mage who had done this to Edgar, and he would have his revenge. The Tier 2s seemed eager enough to let them go, but that might have been because of the extent of their injuries. Jonathan already had a head start, and there was no way that they would catch up to him now that he was running. Earlier in the fight, they probably would have been able to capture him if he had fled, but at this point, with both of the fighters in dire straits, there would be no pursuers. The only problem was that Jonathan was almost running on empty, and he knew that if he stopped, he would collapse, from a combination of having used smite and from his injuries. He had gotten better at dealing with the after-effects of the skill, but he still was affected by it, and in combination with his broken bones, it would be a fatal combination if he fell so close to his enemies. However, Jonathan drew upon his divinity like a man dying of thirst, sucking up the last drops of water available to him, and managed to prolong his skill for long enough to find some sort of shelter. The only problem was that there was none. The land around here was mostly flat, and every prominence on this side of the dungeon was covered by a watchtower or some sort of outpost that was likely teeming with soldiers. If Jonathan went to one of those in this state, he was as good as dead. He needed to find some sort of way to extend his divinity, or else both he and Edgar would be captured before long, which was an unacceptable proposition. Last time they had escaped because Granath and his forces had underestimated Jonathan, but this time they would be ready. There would be no waiting for a trial in a place where Jonathan could use his void powers to escape. He would simply be imprisoned under the watchful eye of Granath himself, and Edgar would be dead. As his divinity ran to empty, Jonathan racked his mind for any way out of this situation. With a start, he remembered that his divinity aspect had something to do with the void. What if he drew upon that power to supplement his own? It was a long shot, but his only one left. Jonathan closed his eyes, relying on his enhanced senses to watch the world around him, and started to pull upon his void energy. It coursed into his hands, racing down the normal channels, but it did nothing for his flagging energy reserves. Frowning, he pushed deeper, feeling that there was a hidden power within his void energy reserves, and if he could find it, it would bolster his current state. As he searched, he could feel a tiny resonance with his divinity that seemed to be the right avenue to accomplishing his goal. He dove into his energy reserves, and started to tug upon that small nugget of power, tearing out a tiny amount of golden-hued purple energy. It slotted into his divinity reserves instantly, and he felt them fill slightly, allowing for him to keep going. He coughed up blood as he felt the reverberations of that spread throughout his body, but it was better than dying. Pulling more of this energy out of his reserves, Jonathan prolonged smite, allowing him to keep running. He flashed across the land, heading for the horizon. As he ran, he could feel his body starting to break down, but he leaned into his battle trance skill, meaning to block out the pain. He would either run or die. There was no in-between. As he ran, he started to lose track of what was going on around him, and some time later he simply collapsed, completely spent. As the darkness claimed him, he smiled faintly, glad that he was finally able to rest. Jonathan was woken by a burning pain in his entire body, cajoling him up from his slumber. Edgar was sitting beside him, scratching absently at a wound on his back. A few monster corpses lay around them, perforated with the signature holes of Edgar's wind-related skills. As Jonathan rose, Edgar let out a sigh of relief, and then pressed a small vial towards Jonathan's hand. Jonathan looked down and saw that it was the health potion from the dungeon. Uncorking it, he downed it in one go, feeling its restorative effects spread throughout his body. His bones creaked as they melded back together, and he let out a sigh of relief. His skin started to knit together, and he eventually was able to stand. Edgar had mostly healed by this point, as none of his wounds had been especially deep, and he was now covered in scars from his experience. "Where are we?" Jonathan asked a moment later, not recognizing the land around him. It was still the same endless expanse of ash as the rest of the ash heaps, but it seemed to be of a slightly lighter shade. Strange shapes jutted out of the ash at odd intervals, and a small stone wall was visible, weathered heavily in some places. "We are in the remnants of a small town, lost ages ago to the encroaching ash. Do you not remember stumbling in here a few hours ago? You must have been further gone than I thought." "Yeah, I had to do some on-the-fly skill alteration to keep us going," Jonathan replied, hiding some of what had happened. He was not ready to explain about his divinity to Edgar. Edgar took this in stride, and started to survey the land around the two men, mainly for the benefit of Jonathan. We traveled about 100 miles away from the dungeon site, or at least as much as I can tell. I was unconscious for most of the time spent running. It seems like you have taken to being my mount quite well. Edgar's face was flat, and Jonathan thought that he was being serious for a moment, but then he smiled. I mean, it seems to work, Jonathan replied, laughing. I must say though, you're pretty hefty for a mage. Edgar scowled in mock anger, and then burst out laughing as well, revealing a side of him that Jonathan had rarely seen before. Maybe you need to add a few more points to strength then. To imagine that you've come this far, and are yet to do so, Edgar replied. On a more serious note though, what are our plans going forward? Right. Here's your armor, Jonathan replied, remembering the suit of mage armor that he had claimed for Edgar in the dungeon. He pulled it out of his storage device, and tossed it over to the man. Edgar nodded in thanks and then donned it, showing off the armor. It was a suit of golden chainmail, with a few plates of solid metal. A motif of a rising sun graced its chest plate, which seemed a little on the nose.